Hey guys. Tonight we slip into the marble-wrapped, wine-soaked dining halls of ancient Rome to unravel a delicious mystery why were Roman emperors so utterly, obsessively fixated on food. The moment you step into the atrium, your senses are ambushed. Roasted meats drip from golden skewers, perfumed oils fog the air, and everywhere you turn, some half-naked noble is reclining dramatically while gnawing on a fig. It's not just gluttony, it's theater, it's politics, it's mythology carved in ham. And, spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this feast without at least one near-fatal encounter with fermented fish sauce. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about this banquet is the opulence. You're not sitting at a rustic wooden table by candlelight, no. You're lounging on an ivory-inlaid triclinium couch with wine being ladled into your mouth like you're some dehydrated potted plant. The servers don't just serve, they glide. And the food? Flamingo tongues, lark-stuffed dormice, jellyfish drizzled in vinegar. It's as if the gods themselves dropped their leftovers into Roman kitchens. That's not far off from how it was intended. Many emperors didn't just eat like gods, they tried to become them. See, Romans believed that the divine and the digestive were oddly intertwined. Food wasn't just fuel, it was a statement of cosmology. You consume exotic animals? That means you've conquered exotic lands. You offer burnt offerings on golden platters? You're in the same league as Jupiter. One bite of honey-glazed peacock and suddenly your dinner table is Olympus. Historians still argue whether this was sincere religiosity or just extravagant cosplay, but one thing is certain: imperial dining was spiritual theater, with a 12-course menu. Take Augustus, for instance. The man practically invented the modest king aesthetic. He played it humble in public, eating coarse bread and cheese while pushing a moral reform agenda, but behind closed doors, the banquets were outrageous. Every olive on his plate was imported. Even the cheese had a title longer than most senators. It was food as diplomacy. If you dined with Augustus, you were either a political ally, a symbolic sacrifice, or both. Each course was a message. Rome is rich, Rome is eternal, and Augustus is the one feeding it all. The dining room, so you can't ignore those. Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house, had banquet halls that rotated. Literally. Some poor engineer had to invent a turntable before disco just so Nero's guests could spin while eating oysters. Ceiling panels opened mid-feast to sprinkle rose petals or, if you were unlucky, deadly surprises. Sometimes you had wine, sometimes you had a python. All part of the experience. And yet, despite the pageantry, it's not just about showing off. There's something else lurking underneath these grand meals. Control. Food becomes a tool for manipulation. You sit beside the emperor, you eat what he eats, and you feel grateful, terrified, but grateful. You're not just swallowing goose liver, you're swallowing loyalty. It's no coincidence that banquets were often held right after a rebellion was crushed or before an unpopular law passed. It's hard to argue with a mouthful of truffles. You glance around the table and see the whispers, the quiet clinks of suspicion. No one knows which dish might be poisoned, which guest might disappear after dessert. The more decadent the setting, the more dangerous the undercurrent. There's something absurd about fearing for your life while chewing on cinnamon-glazed ostrich. But that's Rome for you, paranoia served on silver platters. And then there's the fringe side of it all. You wouldn't believe the culinary quirks. One emperor swore by pickled sow udders. Another demanded that his dishes be dyed purple because regular food colors were too Republican. Caligula, famously threatened to make his horse a consul. But lesser known is the time he declared his dinner table a sacred altar. If you so much as coughed during the appetizer, you risked divine rat hand, possibly exile. You notice the way food mirrors hierarchy. The closer you sit to the emperor, the better your course. Near the head, you get pheasant with spiced date sauce. Further down the table, you're lucky if the lentils still have salt. By the time it reaches the outer ring, it's basically ancient Roman cafeteria slop. And yet, even that is more luxurious than what 99% of Rome eats on a good day. Most citizens are scraping by on grain and sour wine, while here you are, peeling gold leaf off your cheese. Of course, not all emperors were equal in their appetites. Some preferred simplicity to show restraint. Others weaponized extravagance to flaunt superiority. But every single one of them understood this basic truth. Food is the most intimate propaganda. You don't just proclaim power, you digest it. You chew on it slowly while everyone watches, wondering if they'll be fed next or fed to something. And the entertainment? Oh, don't get distracted by the harpist in the corner or the acrobat balancing a goose on his head. Those are appetizers for the eyes. Real distraction lies in the pageantry. While everyone laughs at a jester's wine-soaked stumble, a senator is quietly escorted out by guards, never to return. Dessert often comes with a side of treachery. The wine flows faster now, and your thoughts swirl with it. You're starting to feel the pull of imperial delusion, how easy it is to believe you deserve this feast, that this much silk, spice, and spectacle is your natural due. You look at the emperor, calm and smug, and wonder, does he even taste his food anymore? Or has the performance devoured the man? Historians still debate whether these feasts were sincere expressions of culture or just extravagant distractions from political instability. Some argue they were morale boosters, tools of unity. Others see them as dangerous indulgences that hasten the fall of Rome. Maybe it's both. Maybe, when you dine like a god every night, you eventually forget you're mortal. You recline a little deeper into the couch, your limbs syrupy with wine and goat cheese. A servant approaches with a silver bowl of pine nuts glazed in honey. You're not even hungry, but you eat them anyway. Everyone does. You can't say no. Not here. Not to him. Because at the emperor's table, food isn't just food. It's fate. You're still chewing that last honeyed pine nut when Tiberius wanders into your memory looming, brooding, wrapped in a woolen toga so plain it could be mistaken for a sail. He doesn't fit the profile of an extravagant diner. No gold-threaded cushions, no camel-stuffed camels, no flamingos doing pirouettes on plates. Just Tiberius, shadowy and slow, stepping into a palace kitchen like it's a war council. Because for him, every bite is a security risk, and every guest is a potential assassin. You find yourself on the island of Capri, where Tiberius has sequestered himself in what might be the ancient world's most paranoid luxury retreat. There's a kitchen here, of course, but it's more like a fortress. Meals are prepared in seclusion, watched over by loyal slaves with tongues that may or may not still be attached. Ingredients are tasted, retasted, and sometimes fed to dogs first. If the dog wags its tail, dinner is served. If not, well, there's always lentils. Tiberius doesn't throw the wild parties of his predecessor Augustus. He dines in quiet suspicion, sometimes completely alone. Other times he summons a handful of unfortunate senators, seating them not as guests but as test subjects. You feel that sick flutter in your gut as you realize the honor of being invited may end in indigestion or worse. And yet, the food remains exquisite. A fig picked precisely at noon, mushrooms dusted with myrrh. Fish so fresh it probably didn't even realize it was dead. Every bite is a contradiction refined, beautiful, and laced with existential dread. Historians still argue whether Tiberius was truly the paranoid recluse the sources paint, or if later writers simply exaggerated his eccentricities. Either way, there's one thing no one disputes. He did not trust his food, and that mistrust shaped every meal he ever had. There's something tragic about it, really. You're the most powerful man in the world, and you can't enjoy a piece of fruit without picturing your cousin slipping a little powdered betrayal beneath the skin. But Tiberius wasn't just afraid. He was methodical. His obsession with food control mirrored his obsession with the empire itself. Borders must be defended, rebellions must be preempted, and dinner must be delivered without the faintest trace of arsenic. You see it in the way he trained his chefs, demanding uniformity, measuring recipes like battlefield plans. There's a story, maybe true, maybe imperial gossip, that he once executed a cook for overcooking sea bass. Another tale claims he insisted that each egg yolk on his plate be centered. You don't ask how that's done. You just nod and hope the eggs never run. Even when Tiberius ate for pleasure, which was rare, the experience turned clinical. He had a thing for mulled wine with herbs so bitter your tongue would vibrate. He enjoyed it not for taste, but for the way it numbed the senses like a temporary escape hatch from ruling. You sip it now and feel the tingle, like mint soaked in vinegar. It's awful, and yet oddly comforting, the way a bitter truth can be. Now, of course, not all of Tiberius's behavior was culinary gloom. He had a strange fondness for cucumbers. Legend says he had them grown year-round, using primitive greenhouses with mirrors to reflect sunlight. It's both impressive and absurd engineering advancements, not for wheat, not for olives, but for cucumbers. You imagine Tiberius biting into one with grim satisfaction, while his engineers fan out bronze reflectors around the garden like solar panels for salad. And then there's the fish sauce. Ah, garum, the Roman condiment of choice fermented fish entrails aged in sunlit vats until it smells like Zeus's gym socks and tastes like salty ambrosia. Tiberius had a specific blend he preferred, one only made in a coastal town whose name is lost to time. Couriers carried sealed amphorae across land and sea, just to get the right funk onto his boiled cabbage. That's the sort of power you have when you're emperor. You can demand the exact strain of ancient anchovy rot to accompany your side dish, and no one bats an eye. You recline deeper, and the contrast strikes you how Tiberius's controlled dining style is the polar opposite of the feast from last night. But both, in their own twisted ways, reveal the same core truth. Emperors are obsessed with food because it's the one thing they can control or think they can. When armies fail, when the Senate schemes, when the plebs riot, you can at least choose whether your turnip soup is lukewarm or boiling. And maybe that's why Tiberius clung to food routines with such white-knuckled intensity. Because everything else in his world, loyalty, family, legacy, was so wildly unpredictable. His own son died mysteriously. His allies turned. His reign grew darker with each passing year. But dinner? Dinner could be predictable. It could be measured, sealed, tasted by 3 people before reaching his lips. And so you watch him now, spooning barley gruel with almost religious reverence, as if each mouthful brings order to chaos. There's something strangely intimate about it, isn't there? You can read volumes of ancient law, memoranda, military records, but until you've sat at the table, silently mimicking the emperor's bites so he doesn't feel alone, you don't really know the man. He's guarded, yes. Maybe mad, maybe cruel, but also quietly human in his need to eat without fear. You pass the bread. He breaks it slowly. You both chew. And yet the theater never quite stops. Even alone on Capri, Tiberius understood the symbolism of food. His diet wasn't just private, it was strategic. He rejected the flamboyant meals of the capital, signaling a return to old virtues. Discipline, simplicity, the good Roman way. Whether or not he believed it is beside the point. Everyone else did, or pretended to. And in a world where perception is everything, that was enough. Of course, not all historians agree. Some think the image of Tiberius as a miserly eater was crafted by enemies, meant to portray him as stingy, cruel, or worse boring. But even if exaggerated, there's smoke in the story. Enough to suggest fire once burned in the imperial kitchen, or at least a well-monitored coal brazier, guarded by 4 poison-sniffing slaves. You glance again at the emperor's plate. The cucumbers are gone. The barley is scraped clean. He nods to the attendant. The dishes vanish. And just like that, the moment is over. Another meal survived. Another illusion preserved. And you? You walk away with a belly full of tension and a new respect for the way fear can flavor even the simplest foods. Because for Tiberius, every bite was a gamble, every meal a test of fate, and control? Control was the only seasoning he ever truly trusted. You don't notice him at first, not until the laughter starts. It comes in sharp bursts, half mirth, half menace like a child playing with knives. And then you see him, Caligula, lounging in a robe made of woven pearls, biting into a pastry shaped like the moon. The pastry oozes something red and sticky, possibly cherry, possibly metaphor. He doesn't explain. He just licks the filling off his fingers like it's blood and grins. Welcome to the most unpredictable dinner party of your short, nervous life. With Caligula, food isn't just food. It's spectacle, punishment, adoration, delusion, whatever he decides it should be that day. You take your seat, which is also your station in the emotional roller coaster that is his imperial feast. The table gleams with imported obsidian plates. A mechanical swan made of ivory spits hot-spiced wine from its beak. In the center, an entire roasted boar wears a laurel crown and a sculpted butter mask of Caligula himself. It's horrifying. It's brilliant. You try not to blink too hard. He makes no attempt to feign modesty like Augustus, nor controlled paranoia like Tiberius. No, Caligula wants your jaw on the floor. His banquets are monuments to his ego, and you're just lucky to have a fork, if you get one. He likes to assign tableware randomly golden spoons to one guest, a crust of stale bread on a shovel to another. No pattern, no reason. Today, you get a silver cup. Tomorrow, you may eat off your own sandals. Historians still argue whether Caligula was truly mad, or simply brilliant at weaponizing absurdity. Either way, there's little debate about his flair for culinary drama. One account describes him hosting a feast where every dish contained pearls ground pearls, pearl sauce, pearl-crusted fruit, even pearl pudding. Not for flavor, of course, but for price. He reportedly spent a fortune just to watch senators gag politely on crunchy jewels. The food itself is often impossibly elaborate. Dishes arrive sculpted like gods, cities, animals performing human activities. You're offered a pigeon stuffed with another pigeon, which is in turn stuffed with saffron-soaked dates, each carved to resemble mini busts of his ancestors, a culinary nesting doll of legacy and indigestion. You chew carefully, and try not to offend his great-uncle Germanicus, currently impersonated by a fig. And don't even get started on the fish. Caligula had a favorite eel, allegedly trained to rise from the tank when summoned by name. That eel ate better than most Roman citizens. Once, when a visiting dignitary joked that the fish had more pearls in its pond than his province had gold, Caligula had him served the next night alongside the eel. You didn't just eat at his table. You auditioned. Tonight's entertainment is already spinning into chaos. A group of mimes reenact the founding of Rome, but everyone's wearing aprons and holding ladles. Romulus doesn't murder Remus. With a spear he force-feeds him boiled cabbage. The emperor laughs so hard wine dribbles from his nose. You force a smile and hope it looks sincere. Then he announces a surprise course, edible thunder, a dessert that crackles and smokes when touched. It arrives in silver domes, opened with exaggerated ceremony. Inside, grape-stuffed pastries laced with heated rock salt and vinegar-soaked herbs. It fizzles on your tongue like disappointment at a family reunion. He's pleased. You pretend it's delicious. And yet, underneath the absurdity, something sharper stirs. These meals aren't just about indulgence, they're about dominance. Caligula's madness is curated. Each surreal dish humbles his guests, keeps them off balance, reminds them who holds the fork. You eat not for pleasure but survival. Smile too little, and you offend him. Smile too much, and you seem insincere. One senator once sneezed mid-course and was exiled for questionable expression. He loves to confuse your appetite with your anxiety. Sometimes, he'll serve food made entirely of wax. Other times, real food disguised as inedible objects. There's a story no one can confirm eat off a dinner where all the meats were sculpted to resemble severed limbs. They were lamb and beef, of course, but the effect was enough to clear half the room. The remaining guests were praised for their loyalty and promptly given a second helping. Even when Caligula is generous, the kindness bruises. He once handed out loaves of bread filled with gold coins only to laugh when senators chipped their teeth biting in too fast. Another time, he gifted wine flasks filled with vinegar for clarity. No one could tell if it was a joke or a warning, possibly both. You try to keep pace. The courses never stop. Sea urchin jelly, octopus brain soufflé, milk-glazed duck tongue. A servant offers you an oyster the size of a toddler's fist, perched on a tiny jade throne. You nod and accept it, because what else can you do? You chew. It wobbles. Caligula watches. And that's the thing. He always watches. Even when he pretends to be distracted, when he laughs too hard or makes eyes at a statue, he's measuring reactions, testing loyalties. Food is his arena, and you're part of the spectacle. There's no such thing as a harmless meal here. Every bite is performance. Every toast, a test. He raises a goblet pure crystal, rimmed with powdered golden toasts. The only true god in Rome. Everyone knows he means himself. You echo the toast anyway. Water, wine, or arsenic, it hardly matters. The cup touches your lips. You smile. You survive. At least for now. Still, not every guest is so fortunate. Some are made to eat until they collapse. Others are denied food entirely, left to watch as plates pass them by. Caligula once reportedly invited a noblewoman to dine, and then seated her next to a gluttonous dog, just to watch her squirm. When she asked for bread, he fed the dog instead. The absurdity isn't random, it's curated chaos. A reminder that the emperor's will is the only rule, and that logic has no seat at his table. The one reliable thing about his banquets is unpredictability. That, and the constant presence of dancers dressed like vegetables. You reach dessert, if you can call it that. A sugared sculpture of Mount Vesuvius erupts in cinnamon steam as slave boys reenact, fleeing Pompeii using dates and marzipan. It's oddly beautiful, in a morbid dessert as doom sort of way. You nibble on a candied lava rock. It cracks your molar. You pretend you meant to do that. Finally, the feast begins to wind down. Caligula, draped in silk, gestures for silence. He recites a poem his own, naturally about the tragic hunger of mortals who do not recognize divinity. No one breathes. You clap at the end, softly, like your life depends on it, because it does. And as you exit, stomach stretched, dignity bruised, you realize something unsettling. Caligula's food isn't about taste, it's about transformation. He turns meals into theater, guests into characters, and dining into domination. You walk away not just fed but reshaped, bent around the whims of a man who turned egomania into edible art. Because, in his world, you don't just eat the food. The food eats you back. You wake with a stomach still humming from the memory of Caligula's edible thunder, only to find yourself in a quieter, gentler corner of the imperial world if only for a moment. Claudius is emperor now, and he's many things. Limping, stammering, underestimated. But if there's one thing he excels at, it's midnight snacking. You trail behind him in silk slippers down the marbled halls of the Palatium, guided by flickering oil lamps and the occasional groan of his joints. The servants know the drill. No loud footsteps, no coughing, no sudden movements. Claudius doesn't like surprises unless they're on his plate. He moves through the shadows with the focus of a man on a very specific mission. Not politics, not assassination, not legislation, just cheese. The good stuff. The kind made in a little alpine village where even the goats are picky. Tonight, he stops at a side kitchen tucked behind a tapestry of Mars riding a boar. He lifts the corner, slides through, and you follow like an overeager cat. Inside, the hearth glows. A slave is already placing figs on a heated tile, their skin starting to blister and ooze syrup. A wheel of sheep's milk cheese sweats nearby. Claudius sits, exhales, and finally smiles. He eats in small bites, savoring like a man finally allowed to speak uninterrupted. Historians still argue whether Claudius was truly the bumbling fool portrayed in ancient sources, or a clever manipulator who played dumb to survive. What they agree on is that food was one of his few consistent pleasures. He wasn't flashy like Caligula, or scheming like Tiberius. He liked his meals hot, his sauces strong, and his table full of people who didn't talk over him, which in Rome was a taller order than it sounds. You chew on a fig, the skin splitting under your teeth with a soft snap. It's soothing, comforting, almost normal. That's the trick with Claudiusha, makes the empire feel briefly manageable. Even his larger banquets have a different energy. He prefers reclining in familiar company, scholars, bureaucrats, the occasional gladiator turned poet. Everyone has to try the anchovy paste, though. It's his favorite. Thick, salty, spread on barley crackers like ancient Roman Vegemite. But don't mistake comfort for weakness. Claudius understands the politics of the plate as well as anyone. He keeps detailed records of what he eats, where it came from, who gifted it, and how often it makes him burp. Okay, maybe not the burps, but the man is thorough. Food becomes a bureaucratic language for him. If a provincial governor sends him smoked eels, he notes whether the brine is too sharp. If a senator skips a banquet, Claudius remembers, possibly forever. There's a story that he once promoted a man simply because his olives were perfectly salted. Another tale claims he refused to pardon a general because the man publicly mocked tripe. Tripe, for heaven's sake. You start to realize that under Claudius, the dinner table has become a civil service exam. Eat wisely, season gently, and never criticize the pudding. And yet, Claudius has his strange indulgences too. He's obsessed with mushrooms, especially the white, meaty kind that grow on poplar roots. He orders them with alarming frequency. Eventually, it's his undoing. According to some, his ambitious wife Agrippina finally has enough and bribes the royal cook to slip poison into his favorite fungi. Historians still debate whether it was the mushrooms themselves or a second dose hidden in his porridge that did him in. Either way, it's an ironic end for an emperor who treated food like therapy. You picture it now. Claudius slumped mid-meal, a final mushroom on his plate, a quiet end to a quiet eater. And yet the whisper of power still lingers in his dining habits. He may not have dined with dragons or imported pearl soufflés, but he turned every bite into a decision. Every flavor was weighed against loyalty, tradition, and let's be honest, this deeply personal digestion. One of the fringe accounts claims that Claudius tried to standardize the spice trade just so he could get more reliable access to cinnamon. Whether or not it's true, it fits the pattern. Food isn't just sustenance, it's policy. Under Claudius, meals become schedules, recipes become laws. There's even a rumor he had a rotating menu to reflect the phases of the moon. You can't confirm it, but given his love for lunar omens, it doesn't seem totally out of character. Tonight's menu, at least, is more straightforward. After the figs and cheese, a bowl of lentils arrives, stewed with garlic and cumin. Claudius stirs them slowly, like a philosopher considering the texture of fate. You eat beside him, feeling less like a pawn and more like a person. It's a rare experience in the imperial court. For once, you're not expected to perform or pretend. Just eat. And then comes dessert. Honey cakes, crisp on the edges, soft in the middle, served with a drizzle of pomegranate molasses. The emperor eats 3. You lose count. There's something almost childlike in his enjoyment. A man who knows he could be dead tomorrow and chooses to eat the extra cake anyway. Claudius isn't flashy. He's methodical. But in a way, that makes his food obsession more relatable. Less about domination, more about ritual. Less about godhood, more about digestion. His kitchens aren't theaters, they're archives. Each dish a footnote in his long, awkward legacy. You lean back and sigh, belly full and nerves slightly less frayed than usual. The lamps sputter. Claudius yawns. Somewhere in the palace, a senator is probably plotting his replacement, but here in the warmth of the kitchen, none of that matters. Not for a few more bites. And as you scrape the last bit of lentil from your bowl, you realize something important. Not all emperors need to dazzle. Some just need dinner. You barely have time to digest Claudius's quiet lentils before the world turns theatrical, again blazing, decadent, and absolutely on fire. Quite literally, because now you're dining with Nero, and Nero doesn't do subtle. He doesn't do moderation. He does peacock tongues roasted in saffron, midnight banquets by torchlight, and edible art installations where the centerpiece is a boar stuffed with live songbirds. You sit down at the table, and it's already glowing. The air is thick with incense, perfume, and something suspiciously like molten sugar. The man himself arrives dressed more like a pop star than an emperor. Silk robe shimmering in purple hues that cost enough to bankrupt a province. His neck hung with jewels, and his expression fixed somewhere between delight and derangement. Nero doesn't eat. He performs hunger. He raises a grape to his lips as though it's a final note in a tragic aria, then drops it, uneaten, because it wasn't dramatic enough. Tonight's banquet is set in the imperial gardens. But not just any gardens. These are engineered fantasies of nature, with fountains that spray rosewater, and mechanical birds that flap awkwardly overhead, releasing petals with every creaky wing beat. Bonfires blaze at intervals, illuminating naked statues of gods that look suspiciously like Nero in various heroic poses. Every guest reclines on plush couches, arranged in concentric rings, each tier higher than the last, all gazing inward toward the emperor like satellites, circling a sun with a healthy ego problem. The food begins, and by food, you mean performance pieces you're expected to ingest. First, a tower of prawns stacked like a ziggurat, surrounded by gold-leafed figs and dates carved into erotic figurines. Then goose liver pâté molded into the shape of the Colossus of Rhodes. It jiggles unsettlingly. Someone claps. You're not sure why. You join in. Historians still argue whether Nero actually believed his own grandeur or simply used food and art as tools to distract from his shaky popularity. Maybe it was both. After all, he wasn't born into absolute power. He inherited it through careful scheming and unfortunate family dinner zones that ended with other people mysteriously not waking up. So now, he overcompensates. Through fire, through feasts, through a never-ending buffet of attention-seeking. And of course, through song. Nero famously fancied himself a gifted performer. Halfway through dinner, he rises and announces a spontaneous performance. Everyone claps, not out of enthusiasm, but survival. He proceeds to sing a tragic Greek ballad while slowly walking the length of the dining hall, trailing rose petals and possibly sanity. You eat cautiously during the performance, aware that clinking your cup too loudly could be interpreted as criticism. One senator once sneezed during Nero's ballad, and was never seen again. The emperor returns to his seat and demands applause. You oblige, still chewing on what might be ostrich cartilage or marshmallow. Hard to tell. Then comes the showpiece, the fire-roasted feast. Servants carry in whole animals cooked in underground pits, aromatic smoke trailing behind them like lazy ghosts. A pig's belly is sliced open, and hundreds of tiny sausages tumble out, already steaming. The crowd gasps. Nero beams. You try not to look overwhelmed. But the fire isn't just for cooking. Flames surround the dining space, dancing in tall braziers. Some guests whisper that Nero once staged a banquet during the Great Fire of Rome itself, standing on a rooftop, sipping wine while watching the city burn. Whether or not that's true, the imagery sticks. Fire and food as twin obsessions seem inseparable. Even the wine is dramatic. It's spiced with cloves, cinnamon, and something unidentifiable that makes your ears buzz. The cups are oversized, etched with scenes from tragic myths: Tantalus, Sisyphus, Icarus, all men undone by hunger, ambition, or hubris. You suspect that's intentional. A warning? A joke? Maybe Nero doesn't know the difference. And then the night turns. Not suddenly, but like a wine-dark tide. The laughter gets louder, the food saltier, the air thicker. You've been reclining for hours, and your limbs feel heavy with meat and anxiety. Nero is on his second performance now, this time reenacting a scene from the Iliad with a lyre and a disturbingly accurate foam horse. Dessert is served during Act III, an entire mountain made of candied chestnuts, with honey rivers and sugar bridges. You bite into one and chip a tooth. Still, you smile. Behind the spectacle is a quieter truth. Nero uses food the way an illusionist uses smoke. He hides danger beneath sweetness, cruelty behind beauty. Not everyone at the table is here voluntarily. There's a senator whose son disappeared last week, a noblewoman who once dared to speak her mind and now wears silence like a second tunic. Everyone eats, but few truly taste. One of Nero's lesser-known quirks? He hated cold food. Everything had to be piping hot-even fruit. There's an absurd account of him demanding that peaches be grilled and served with mustard. The result? Charred disappointment. But no one said a word. You wouldn't either. You'd nod and say, "Fascinating flavor profile, Caesar." Then pretend to enjoy it while mentally writing your will. Another eccentric habit. He kept a personal team of tasters, not just for poison, but for aesthetic consistency. One story says he executed a baker whose bread was a shade too tan. Another time, a chef was exiled for serving an overcooked songbird. That same chef later opened a successful stall in Alexandria. Allegedly. Probably under a different name. You're beginning to feel the weight of it all, the indulgence, the heat, the unrelenting flavor parade. Every muscle in your body begs to recline permanently. The table is sticky with wine and sauce. Someone nearby has fallen asleep mid-peach. Nero is laughing now, a deep, musical laugh that echoes through the colonnade. He seems pleased. That's good. When Nero is happy, people tend to survive. As the final course arrives, an enormous jelly molded in the shape of the Roman Empire, you realize this isn't just a feast, it's a prophecy. A gelatinous, wobbling vision of a world ruled by a man who thinks theatrical excess is sound policy. You scoop a piece out of gall. It tastes like rosewater and regret. The night winds down with a round of toasts. Nero raises his goblet and declares the evening a triumph. "Tonight, the gods dined with us," he says. You murmur agreement, your lips numb from cinnamon and fear. Somewhere, a harpist begins to play. Somewhere else, a guard tightens his grip on his spear. And as you stumble out of the glowing garden, breath thick with saffron and char, you understand what Nero knew all too well. When the empire feels like it's collapsing, throw a bigger party. Add more gold. Roast more boars. Sing louder. Because if Rome burns, Let it burn with a full stomach. You shuffle forward on sore feet, belly still gurgling with whatever poetic nightmare Nero called dessert, only to find yourself stepping into a banquet where the food might just kill you, but not because it's undercooked. This is where dinner becomes execution, where courses double as cautionary tales, and every sip might be your last. Welcome to the era when the imperial table wasn't just about indulgence, it was a deadly arena. Poison and power now share a platter. You've heard the whispers before, even under Augustus and Tiberius, but here it's sharper, more deliberate. The utensils are clean, but the intent isn't. As you recline at this new feast, your instincts go taut. Servants come and go too quickly. Goblets change hands in peculiar choreography. Eyes dart not just toward the emperor, but toward the wine decanter. You've never focused so hard on a jug of Falernian in your life. See, for many Roman emperors, the greatest threat didn't come from battlefields or barbarian hordes, it came from their own kitchens. Food was the perfect weapon, silent, deniable, and deeply intimate. Historians still argue whether some of the most dramatic imperial deaths were assassinations or just culinary misfortune, but the line between indigestion and conspiracy was blurrier than garum in low light. Take Britannicus, the son of Claudius. One moment, he's sipping a warm cup of wine at dinner. The next, he's twitching on the floor, his skin pale as the tablecloth. Nero, who conveniently inherits full power afterward, insists it was an allergic reaction. Sure, and the boar probably poisoned itself. You sip your own wine a little more cautiously. It tastes fine, maybe too fine. That's the thing. Poison wasn't just about effectiveness, but elegance. A proper imperial poison shouldn't be tasted, smelled, or noticed until it's too late. Something that slides down smooth and then slices your insides like a dagger. Many came from exotic roots, rare minerals, or compounds only the palace physician understood, or pretended to. And the tasters? Oh, they exist. Every emperor with half a brain employed them, usually slaves, sometimes eunuchs, rarely volunteers. These unfortunate souls spent their days nibbling crusts and sipping sauces, hoping that the emperor's paranoia wasn't justified today. If they survived long enough, they might get promoted. If not, well, at least someone noticed their absence at breakfast. You glance around this particular banquet and spot the subtle dance of the palace staff. One server switches cups just before pouring. Another adjusts a plate's position ever so slightly, aligning it with a flick of the eyes from someone higher up. Is it precaution? Theater? Or is someone's death about to be plated with lemon and rosemary? One of the fringe tales you recall tonight involves Domitiana, later emperor, with the charm of a rusty blade and the disposition of a kicked wasp. Supposedly, he had his wine collection secretly numbered so he could test loyalty by offering a random vintage, then tracking whether the recipient praised the correct flavors. Get it wrong? Off with your tongue. Or worse, a reassignment to latrine duty in Britannia. Domitian also became notorious for night banquets lit entirely in black marble tables, black robes, black candles. Guests were served darkened foods beets, figs, dyed meats and black plates, in silence. No music, no laughter. Just the soft crunch of roasted locusts and the suspicion that this might be your last meal. You'd sit there, trying to swallow a prune-stuffed nightingale without crying, wondering if the absence of salt meant anything. And this obsession with poison didn't stop at suspicion. Some emperors studied toxins with the enthusiasm of culinary students. There's a wild rumor that Caracalla kept a personal notebook of poisonous recipes: grapes laced with belladonna, wine infused with powdered emeralds, even methods for coating fig stems in slow-acting venom. The idea wasn't always instant death. Sometimes it was weeks of decline, just long enough to confuse the investigation. You've probably heard about the infamous Locusta, Rome's first celebrity poisoner. Employed by Agrippina, mother of Nero, and later by Nero himself, she mixed fatal cocktails, like she was hosting her own cooking show. Her poisons were so precise, she could customize the reaction: instant spasm, slow suffocation, a quiet sleep. She trained other assassins, too, because why should murderers be self-taught? At one point, Nero even built her a poison lab. Picture that, a quiet villa near Rome, white columns, maybe a little garden, and inside, rows of flasks bubbling with death, herbs ground into dust finer than sugar, and a professional murderer in a tidy apron muttering, "Not enough henbane." You chew a bit more slowly now, aware that your olives might be a bit too bitter. Or maybe that's just nerves. One of the guests across the room turns green and excuses himself. You pretend not to notice. So does everyone else. A few brave souls dab at their mouths with napkins as if to say, "If I'm going to die at dinner, at least let me be elegant." The anxiety didn't just live in the palace. It seeped through every layer of Roman elite society. Dinner invitations became tactical events. Refuse and look suspicious. Attend and risk death by stuffed dormouse. Even food gifts once, considered polite tokens, were received with caution. A particularly fragrant honey cake from an ally? Better feed it to the cat first, or a slave, or both. Over time, some emperors tried to curb this culinary paranoia with more surveillance. Kitchens were guarded, ingredients catalogued, herbs inventoried like military supplies. In one case, an entire shipment of saffron was burned after someone whispered that it had been tampered with. No evidence, just a vibe. And the truly paranoid? They took it even further. Diocletian reportedly had a private mountain villa where only one cook was allowed entry: an old friend, possibly a relative, whose loyalty was so strong that he had to swear oaths before each meal. Another emperor, less trusting, had multiple dishes prepared by different chefs in separate kitchens, each unaware of the final combination. The emperor would then pick a plate at random. It was like roulette, but with pigeon pie. There's a reason these men often seemed on edge, even during the grandest feasts. For all the golden cups and peacock wings, the imperial table was never really safe. It was a gilded trap, and no one, not even the host, knew who might spring it. Even now, your own feast continues. You lift your cup, pause, and switch it with the one beside you. No one bats an eye. That's the thing, you're all doing it. Quiet little evasions, shrugging off the taste of your own mortality. And yet, despite it all, they kept eating. They kept hosting these deadly dinners, inviting rivals, rewarding chefs, decorating cakes with gold and gooseberries, as if the ritual could keep the darkness at bay. Food, even laced with fear, still mattered. It was power. It was ceremony. It was the last luxury of doomed men. You chew one last bite of roasted fig, trying not to imagine it hiding a tiny, tasteless drop of doom. It's delicious, honestly, almost worth the risk. Almost. You might think after narrowly surviving an evening of poisoned figs and suspicious wine that things would settle into something duller, safer. But then you hear a fart, loud, proud, followed by uproarious laughter from the head of the table. You turn your head, stunned. The Emperor Vespasian wipes his eyes, still chuckling, and waves for more lentils. Welcome to a Roman banquet, where the mood swings from cynical to slapstick in under 60 seconds, and where food still says everything about who's really in charge, even if it comes with a side of fart jokes. Vespasian, the man who clawed his way up from modest origins to rule Rome, is many things. Practical, dry-humored, sharp. He also happens to be the first emperor in a long while who's openly comfortable being ordinary. Gone are the days of pearl-dusted peacocks and edible thunder. Vespasian serves cabbage and makes fun of people who don't like it. You're at a table with fewer golden goblets and more sarcastic commentary. And you know what? It's kind of refreshing. The food is still good, Don't get the wrong idea, but there's something intentionally plain about it. Roasted turnips, pickled leeks, salted pork belly with just enough crackle to make your teeth sing. The emperor doesn't do lavish. He does hearty. You bite into bread that was actually kneaded this morning by someone who knew how to use a kneading board. The olive oil isn't from some far-off island blessed by Neptunites from just outside Rome. Tastes peppery, feels honest. Historians still argue whether Vespasian's simple palate was authentic or strategic. Was he truly a humble eater, or just positioning himself as a man of the people after years of imperial madness? Either way, the results are the same. His dinners are less about ego and more about control through relatability. Where Nero used gold-plated poultry to assert divine status, Vespasian uses garlic breath and burping contests to disarm his court, and somehow it works. There's something radical about his casual crudeness. He keeps the mood light, the wine flowing, and his guests slightly off-balance, not with fear, but with dad jokes and economic jabs. Tonight, he points at a plate of chickpeas and says, "Behold, the currency of the gods." Someone laughs. He grins and adds, "That's how we'll pay the army this year." And he probably will. He's famous for turning personal stinginess into imperial policy. There's a fringe story that when his son Titus complained that taxing public urinals was beneath the dignity of an emperor, Vespasian handed him a coin and asked if it smelled like pee. "No," he said. "Then stop complaining." You better believe that legend gets told at the dinner table more than once, usually while someone's chewing on a boiled artichoke. Even the setting reflects his style. The dining room is functional, not fabulous. Walls are painted, not gilded. There's a mosaic of Mercury, delivering bread to a family of goats. And for some reason, it's funnier the more you drink. The furniture creaks. The platters clatter. Someone drops a spoon and nobody dies for it. Amazing. But don't mistake the humor for softness. Vespasian may enjoy lentils, but he's a military man, and he knows the value of discipline even in dining. Latecomers to his feasts don't get seated. Drunken guests are sent home without fanfare. He expects decorum, even if he peppers it with sarcasm. One senator learns this the hard way after mocking the simplicity of the dessert, just honey cakes and fruitant, finds himself uninvited from the next 4 dinners. Vespasian doesn't scream. He just scratches your name off the guest list like it's a tax write-off. What sets his meals apart isn't what's on the plate, but how it's used. You're not being seduced with flavor, you're being tested through humility. You sip the same wine as the emperor not because it's rare, but because he doesn't think he needs better. It's a political performance disguised as plainness. He's saying, "I'm not like those marble-wrapped maniacs before me. I eat cabbage, just like you." Of course, the cabbage is still served by 12 silver-plated slaves, but the point stands. And he uses food to remind everyone who's paying for it. Vespasian is obsessed with revenue. He'll toast a new tax policy before dessert. He jokes about raising tariffs on foreign spices while chewing dried figs. At one banquet, he reportedly offered a prize for the guest who could name the most provinces with the least impressive food. The winner received a year's worth of vinegar. Second place got a goat. Third place, an invitation to dine again next week. Vespasian was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. There's a fringe account that he once made an entire table of senators eat military rations for a full corsedried grain biscuits, lukewarm wine, and boiled meat wrapped in cloth, just to remind them what the army was enduring on the Germanic front. Some protested. One vomited. Vespasian laughed and doubled their tax assignments for the month. "If you can't chew leather," he said, "you can at least write checks." And yet, even his crudeness has grace. When a foreign ambassador brings him candied almonds from Persia, Vespasian is delighted. He eats them with genuine joy and insists on sharing them around. You taste one oddly floral and sticky. Not your thing, but he's thrilled. That's the thing about Vespasian. He likes real things, honest flavors. He'd rather have a good onion than a gold-plated grape. He once said that a man who eats only for show is a man who starves in disguise. And, honestly, it tracks. You catch him during a quiet moment between courses, sipping watered wine and slicing his bread with a tiny bronze knife. He looks tired, but focused. This isn't a pleasure meal. It's a performance of modesty. A political act where every mouthful declares, "I am not insane. I am not divine. I am the emperor, and I burp just like you." And then he burps. Loudly. The room freezes. Then laughs. Someone coughs up a lentil. You sit back and realize, this is how Vespasian rules. Through humor, through honesty, through small meals with big messages. His table is a stage, just like his predecessors. But the play is different. It's not, "Look how rich I am." It's, "Look how much Rome needs a guy who can eat turnips without collapsing into poetry." As the evening winds down, you chew a final chunk of honeycomb and feel oddly grounded. There's no rose-petal blizzard, no edible volcano, no fig laced with poison, just a full belly, a warm room, and the scent of roasted onions. And maybe that's Vespasian's secret. He reminds everyone that Rome doesn't have to be madness. Sometimes, it can just be dinner. You're feeling almost relaxed after that modest, fart-accompanied feast with Vespasian when the mood shifts yet again. Suddenly, the warmth of roasted onions and unfiltered sarcasm is replaced with a cool, calculating tension that clings to your skin like a cold mist. The hall gleams with polished obsidian and stiff silence. You're now under the gaze of Domitian. This man doesn't dine. He scrutinizes. Even before the first course, you can feel it. The chill in the air, the stillness in the servants' movements, the unnaturally symmetrical arrangement of the platters. A roasted duck sits in front of you, with its wings folded just so. The grapes are in exact pyramids. Someone adjusted the candlestick 3 times. You suspect one napkin was executed for being slightly wrinkled. Domitian arrives, not with trumpets or song, but like a bad mood with legs. His robe is pure white, his face unreadable. He doesn't smile, he doesn't speak, he just sits. His food, already waiting, is warm, but not hot. You know that because someone has clearly checked it 4 times. It's not just paranoia, it's procedure. Historians still argue whether Domitian's increasingly harsh reign was due to megalomania, childhood trauma, or just an unfortunate personality. What's not up for debate is that his dinners became less about celebration and more about surveillance. Everyone eats, but no one enjoys. Each bite is measured, each reaction filed away for future reference. The first course is olives and cold cuts. Nothing unusual until you realize each guest has the exact same number of olives. 7. No more, no less. One man quietly eats his 8th. You glance sideways, then downward. There's a shuffle. Within minutes, that guest is summoned away. Indigestion, someone mutters. Sure, indigestion with a side of vanishing. You swallow carefully. The wine arrives next, in crystal cups etched with images of Roman justice scales, swords, blindfolded women. You take a sip. It's dry, almost sour. Not unpleasant, but you can't shake the feeling that it's judging you. Domitian raises his own cup, barely drinks, then places it back down without a word. He doesn't need to drink. His appetite is for control. He's known for preferring solitary meals. The banquets he does host are stiff formalities, orchestrated down to the second. Music plays, but it's slow, minor key, probably written by a composer who hadn't smiled since Vespasian's funeral. The food follows a theme. Everything is white. White fish, white sauce, white beans, white bread. A tribute to purity, or so his advisors claim, or maybe just another way to remind everyone who paints the palette. The conversation, such as at Isis, muted. Guests speak in murmurs. A noblewoman laughs too brightly, then pretends it was a cough. Domitian glances her way. The temperature drops another 2 degrees. You chew your bread crust and hope it sounds appropriately reverent. But for all his cold precision, Domitian does have culinary preferences. He favors stewed lamb, lentil, veal always served in covered bowls, always the same size. He's obsessed with temperature. Every dish must arrive warm but not steaming. Legend has it he once dismissed a cook for serving porridge that burned his tongue. Not because he was hurt, because it meant the cook wasn't paying attention. There's a fringe account that Domitian created an entire ranking system for imperial meals, complete with forms and evaluations. Flavor, texture, temperature, timing, everything was scored. At the bottom of each scroll was a question: did this meal reflect the dignity of Rome? You can imagine the anxiety of being a palace chef under that kind of rubric. Overcook the beans, and suddenly, your citizenship is up for review. He was also fond of exotic imports, just not too exotic. Dates from Africa were welcome. Dates from Parthia, suspicious. Pomegranates were fine, but only if they came through authorized channels. He feared infiltration through agriculture. Once, an envoy offered him cinnamon from beyond the Kushite lands. Domitian sniffed it once and had it burned. Too fragrant, he said. Too foreign. You start to understand the message baked into the meal. This isn't about flavor. This is about order. The meal is the empire. And everything, every olive, every cutlet, must know its place. Even the guests. You're not eating. You're demonstrating compliance. A course of poached eel arrives in near silence. The server bows low enough to brush the floor. Domitian tastes it first. He doesn't flinch, which is somehow more unsettling than if he had. You taste your own portion. It's delicate, slightly acidic, swimming in a broth so clear you can see your reflection. You try not to think about that too hard. Domitian occasionally stabs his food without eating it, like he's practicing. One senator tries to joke about the cost of eel in the provinces. No one laughs. Domitian blinks, then reaches for his knife, not to eat, but to carve a design into his bread. You realize too late that the senator is sweating. The bread design appears to be a noose. Still, not everything is quite so grim. At one point, a server presents candied rose petals and sugared pine nuts on an obsidian platter. Domitian watches, then allows a faint nod. The guests exhale, collectively. You nibble a rose petal. It's delicious, surprisingly light, like floral snow. You wonder if this means dessert is safe. Then again, maybe that's the trick. He sometimes gives food as political cues. If you're served roasted chestnuts, it means he trusts you. If your plate is refilled with the same dish twice, he's testing you. If nothing arrives at all, well, best start writing your will. One official famously resigned after receiving only a single dry biscuit. He claimed it was louder than 1,000 decrees. As the feast wears on, the guests grow quieter. Conversation tapers into coughs and small nods. You feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down. You remember a story about how Domitian once declared his own goldfish more loyal than his generals. You hope he's not watching your fork too closely. And yet, you can't deny the efficiency. There's no waste, no excess, no flamingos or rotating ceilings. Domitian has stripped the Roman banquet of all its flamboyant plumage and left the bones, a mechanism of power, discipline, and unspoken threat. It's terrifying, but oddly effective. By the final course, grapes, perfectly peeled and quartered, you find yourself matching the emperor's pace, mirroring his gestures, even swallowing when he does. You didn't mean to, but that's the brilliance of it. His dinner isn't a performance, it's a ritual. And you are already part of it, whether you like it or not. Domitian stands. The room rises in unison. No speech, just a look. And then he leaves, vanishing like a gust of winter air behind a velvet curtain. You exhale. You survived. But next time, you'll count your olives more carefully. You stagger from Domitian's dining hall like someone who's just completed a culinary military drill, knees stiff, stomach uncertain, dignity only slightly bruised. And just when you think you'll never eat another quartered grape again, the tone of the empire shifts once more. This time it's not about fear or farce, decadence or discipline. You smell roasted meat on open flame, hear the clang of shields nearby, and suddenly you're eating with Trajanthi soldier emperor, the builder of empires, and, surprisingly, a man who appreciates a good stew more than any peacock tongue. You're seated on a folding camp stool, surrounded by men in polished armor who've probably marched through 3 provinces just to get here. The table is Modesto gold, no gems, not even a mosaic floor in sight. Just packed earth, leather tents, and the occasional dog sniffing around for scraps. And yet, there's warmth here. Purpose. Unity. Trajan believed in sharing meals with his troops, and not just for show. For him, eating together was leadership. The spoon was a symbol of solidarity. Historians largely agree that Trajan set the gold standard for imperial virtue. He was competent, fair, and immensely popular, a rare trifecta in Roman politics. And it showed in his meals. Tonight's supper features lentils stewed with onions, salted pork sliced thick, and crusty bread made from the same grain his soldiers eat. No silk napkins, just a pile of olives in a shared bowl, a jug of watered wine passed around with the ease of campfire conversation. It's not glamorous, but it's real. Trajan's not performing modesty the way Vespasian did, nor weaponizing taste like Domitian. He's living it. You watch him laugh with a centurion, then offer a second helping of bean mash to a weathered foot soldier. It's strange to see an emperor who doesn't need a pedestal or a plate made of Giudetto remind you who's in charge. And yet, even here, power speaks through food. The fact that the emperor eats with the army rather than above it is a message. You chew your lentils slowly and realize the political brilliance hidden in the steam of this humble stew. Every spoonful says, "We're in this together." It's loyalty through meat and legumes. Of course, Trajan could indulge when he wanted to. Back in Rome, his public feasts were legendary not for excess, but for scale. When he returned from his conquest of Dacia, he reportedly hosted a banquet for 5,000 people. Picture it. Long tables winding through the forum, mountains of bread, rivers of wine, and servers moving like ants through a labyrinth of roasted lamb. You grab a date from the platter and imagine it once came from a crate stacked 6 deep on a barge, sailing up the Tiber just for this kind of spectacle. But even his grandest feasts retain structure. He was obsessed with logistics. It's said he personally reviewed meal plans for state dinners, not to nitpick just to make sure everything worked. He didn't care if the sauce was flamboyant, but he absolutely cared if it was on time. One legend tells of a feast in which the bread was late by 10 minutes. He didn't fire the baker. He reassigned him to the engineering corps, where he apparently became quite successful. There's a fringe rumor that Trajan invented a kind of proto-field kitchen for his soldiers, carts equipped with portable braziers, fold-out tables, and spice compartments, what you might call the ancient Roman food truck. Whether or not it's true, the idea fits his legacy. Feed your army well, and you feed your empire. And Trajan didn't just feed soldiers. He fed the poor. His Alimenta program provided food subsidies and loans to struggling families, ensuring their children could grow up healthy and, ideally, grateful. These weren't random acts of kindness, they were calculated investments in the next generation of Romans. His policies were written in grain and oil, not just ink. You take another bite of roasted goat, seasoned with thyme and garlic, and feel oddly nourished, like you're part of something sturdier than the velvet-draped whims of earlier emperors. Trajan doesn't want your awe, he wants your service. And he's smart enough to know that hungry people don't build roads, don't fight barbarians, and definitely don't carve his face into triumphal arches. There's music tonight, but it's from a single flute and a drum. Nothing rehearsed, just a rhythm that matches the pace of tired men finally eating after a long march. The emperor lifts a clay cup-knot crystal. Not even Bronzan drinks. You drink too. The wine is sharp, earthy, slightly smoky. Someone says it was aged in a cave outside Naples. Someone else says it fell off a cart last week. Either way, it does the job. Trajan has quirks too. He loves garum, that fermented fish sauce beloved and loathed across the empire. He puts it on everything. Bread, beans, even fruit. One soldier quietly gags when Trajan spoons it onto melon slices. The emperor laughs and says, "More for me." You try it. It's briny. Like fruit swimming in the wrong part of the ocean. You smile anyway. As the meal winds down, the soldiers begin to relax. Stories are told, some true, some definitely not. One man claims he once saw a Gaul eat an entire eel without chewing. Another says his sister makes a barley porridge so thick it can stop a spear. The emperor listens, nods, and occasionally chimes in with a dry joke. You almost forget he commands legions. Almost, because at the end of the meal, when the plates are cleared and the fire burns low, Trajan stands. He doesn't raise a golden goblet or demand applause. He just lifts his hand and thanks his men. And that's it. No fanfare, no live fish fountains. Just a moment of quiet respect, and then he walks away. You stare into the embers and think about how food, again, has drawn the shape of power, not with diamonds or exotic birds, but with lentils and camaraderie. It's the kind of meal that leaves you full in ways you didn't expect. And as you stretch your legs and brush breadcrumbs from your tunic, you realize something important. Not all emperors wanted to be gods. Some just wanted to be good. You don't need to stretch your legs far before the scene changes again, and now you're walking not toward a palace or a campfire, but across the known world itself, led by an emperor with a trimmed beard, a scroll in his pocket, and a roasted duck thigh in hand. Hadrian, Rome's traveling emperor, isn't waiting for the feast to come to him. He's bringing his appetite with him across deserts, forests, islands, and mountains, turning dinner into diplomacy and lunch into an imperial walking tour. You trudge alongside his entourage under a hazy Mediterranean sky, passing olive groves and sheep that clearly don't know they're destined for soup. Every few miles, someone hands you something new: flatbread wrapped in fig leaves, grilled sardines, honey-soaked pastries the size of your palm. Hadrian isn't just snacking, he's curating. You've heard of food tourism, sure. But this? This is cuisine as conquest. Historians largely agree that Hadrian traveled more extensively than any other Roman emperor. He visited nearly every province of the empire, often choosing backwater towns over glittering capitals. And he dined with everyone: Greek poets, Egyptian priests, Spanish fishermen, Gallic war veterans, all seated on blankets or benches, under awnings or in the open air, gnawing on whatever local dish was famous within a 100-mile radius. Tonight, you're somewhere along the Aegean coast. You can tell by the grilled octopus and the crisp white wine that smells faintly of sea air and ancient ambition. The tableif. You can call a plank balanced on amphorae. A tableus covered in regional specialties: stuffed grape leaves, spiced lamb skewers, pickled vegetables, chickpea pancakes so hot they singe your fingertips. Hadrian sits at the center, not above or apart, but right there with you, tearing bread like a local god disguised as a civil engineer. He talks between bites, always asking questions. How do they salt the fish? Where do the pomegranates grow best? Which olives yield the softest oil? He's not making conversation, he's collecting intelligence. Hadrian understands what many rulers missed: that the way to rule a vast, fragmented empire is not just through armies and walls, but through taste. through food, through the things people are proud of when they think no one's watching. There's a fringe account, possibly exaggerated, possibly not, that Hadrian once delayed a border negotiation because he got distracted by a local pastry. The envoy waited hours while the emperor asked the baker about wheat quality, honey viscosity, and regional pine nut sourcing. He eventually signed the treaty with sticky fingers and declared the pastry the real conquest. It's not just novelty, though. Hadrian's food obsession ties into his philosophical streak. He loves Greek culture, their philosophy, their language, their food, especially their food. He's known to have waxed poetic about olive oil quality like a lovesick teenager. One dinner in Athens included a 10-minute toast entirely about chickpeas in moderation. The philosophers in attendance nodded solemnly. One may have quietly burped. Back in Rome, Hadrian imported his favorite flavors from abroad. His villas had separate kitchens dedicated to different cuisines: Egyptian stews, Syrian flatbreads, Spanish cured meats. His estate in Tivoli? A culinary playground. The fish ponds were stocked with creatures from every corner of the empire. There's a rumor he tried to breed a hybrid fish, specifically for roasting, though scholars still argue whether it ever made it past the marinating stage. You pass a vineyard now, following his pace as he walks barefoot down the rows, plucking grapes and muttering about acidity. He stops to share a leaf-wrapped cheese parcel with a boy carrying a basket of herbs. You swear Hadrian asks more questions about oregano than he ever did about taxation. And yet, there's method here. Food isn't just comfort or curiosity, it's Hadrian's version of infrastructure. He uses meals to learn what roads need repairing, what crops are failing, which markets thrive. When he tastes, he listens. When he listens, he rules. You once saw him delay a speech to try a fish stew offered by a retired legionary. That dish ended up on the imperial menu for months, because Hadrian believed loyalty started in the stomach. Of course, there's a shadow in every empire. You notice it as the caravan moves through a struggling village. There's no feast here, just barley mash and thin soup. Hadrian insists on eating the same meal as the villagers, seated cross-legged on a threadbare mat, dipping crusts into broth with the same spoon as a goat herder. He frowns at the flavor not with disgust, but with concern. You hear him say the grain subsidies need adjusting. He orders a note sent to Rome. Later, under the stars, someone roasts a pigeon. Hadrian tears it in half and shares it with you, skin crisp, meat dark and earthy. He sprinkles it with sumac, pinches your arm lightly, and says, "It needs more smoke next time." You nod and wonder if this is how recipes become imperial edicts. He had a sweet tooth too, but quietly. He favored date cakes from North Africa, dense and sticky and rolled in sesame. He'd always take two and pretend to save one for later, but somehow both disappeared before the next town. Some say his most trusted advisors were really just the ones who brought him the best desserts. Still, for all his wanderlust, Hadrian understood that not every dish was for every audience. At formal Roman banquets, he reigned at squid ink stews or barley beer experiments. Just the classics. Cured meats, roasted birds, fruits carved into ridiculous shapes. But even then, he made sure one or two regional dishes appeared at every meal. Just enough to remind the senators that the empire wasn't just Romiat, was everyone's dinner table. You recline now on a hillside overlooking the sea, belly full, hands sticky with honey, and realize this was Hadrian's quiet revolution. No blaring trumpets or purple silk, just vine leaves and grilled onions, and a quiet promise. Rome isn't here to erase you. It's here to taste you. You awaken with a bit of fig paste clinging to your fingers, the scent of rosemary still tucked into your hair, only to find yourself back within the marble columns of Rome. The wind smells of fountains and iron, and a new Emperor Antoninus Pius sits before you, calm as a man who just finished reorganizing his spice drawer. This is the emperor who rarely makes headlines, never throws orgies, and isn't once accused of turning a banquet into a murder scene. And you know what? He's exactly what Rome needs after all that traveling and trauma. Antoninus Pius is the broccoli of Roman emperors, solid, dependable, maybe a little bland, but absolutely essential to digestion. His dining table reflects that. The food is simple, seasonal, and suspiciously delicious for something that looks so plain. Chickpeas again. A lot of barley. And are you even surprised at this point? Lentils. You're starting to suspect that lentils could run for office in Rome and win. Still, there's charm here. You sit at a modest banquet, reclining not on jewel-studded couches but comfortable, if squeaky, cushions. The silverware is polished but not boastful. The napkins are linen. The bread is crusty. Antoninus dips his in olive oil with a little dash of sea salt, nods in approval, and that's the highlight of the evening. Historians agree that Antoninus Pius was a model of administrative efficiency and personal restraint. His reign was notably peaceful, free of major wars or grandiose projects. It's said he only left Italy a handful of times, and even then, reluctantly. And yet, he managed to keep the empire humming like a well-fed cat. You see that mindset in his meals. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive, everything balanced. If Trajan's dinner was about camaraderie, and Hadrian's about curiosity, Antoninus's is about consistency. Tonight, you're served a dish called pulsa porridge of emmer wheat, topped with a handful of stewed vegetables and a drizzle of honey. It's earthy, warming, and oddly satisfying. The emperor eats quietly, no showmanship, no elaborate toasts. He smiles occasionally, says little. The kind of man who finishes his plate and then asks if there's anything he can do to help with cleanup. He does, however, love cheese. Soft, tangy, aged in fig leaves. There's an entire platter of cheeses from various provinces, a crumbly one from Gaul, a creamy slab from Sicily, a sharp wheel from Hispania. He samples each with the care of a librarian, checking the spines of beloved books. You try the Gaulish one, it bites back. He nods at your courage. Despite his soft-spoken nature, Antoninus uses meals to reinforce stability. He hosts senators regularly, not to impress them, but to remind them that Rome doesn't need fire and fury to function. His banquets are part therapy, part routine. The empire is calm, his table is calm, and therefore you should be calm. He even introduced food-based rituals into court life, a shared cup of wine before major decisions, a morning biscuit before public speeches, an afternoon fig with his wife, Faustina, who often dines beside him with a knowing glance. There's a fringe story that he invented a kind of imperial lunchbox, a sealed wooden container that held a day's worth of small meals, carefully rationed to match his preferred caloric intake. Whether true or not, it paints a vivid picture. The emperor as a man who doesn't need luxury to feel powerful. A man who can rule the world and still pack his own snacks. And don't think the food is boring just because it's not flamboyant. There are hidden gems, a savory custard made from eggs, herbs, and a hint of anchovy. Pears stewed in red wine until they practically melt on the tongue. Almond-stuffed dates dusted with ground sesame and cloves. Subtle, yes, but crafted with care. Antoninus is fond of kitchen staff, too. He once promoted a cook not for inventing a new dish, but for perfecting an old one. A good empire, he supposedly said, does not need new recipes every day. It needs chefs who know how not to ruin the sauce. That line gets passed around in kitchens for years. One night, a senator attempts to impress the emperor by gifting him a whole sturgeon wrapped in fig leaves and embroidered silk. It arrives with a band of musicians and a poem. Antoninus listens, accepts the fish with grace, then quietly asks the kitchen to remove the silk and return it to the senator's tailor. The fish should be honored by its flavor, he says. You have never seen a man blush harder than that senator. There's also an ongoing mystery about his pomegranate obsession. The imperial gardens grow multiple varieties. He prefers the deep red kind with seeds so sweet they make your molars ache. It's said he could eat 5 in one sitting, though he always made it look like 2. When he shares a segment with you, cool, tart, bursting, you feel oddly blessed, like you've passed some secret test. And that's the strange thing about dining with Antoninus. On the surface, it's the most forgettable meal in the empire. But beneath that simplicity is precision, discipline, intention. He doesn't just eat, he models moderation, fairness, continuity. His restraint becomes a kind of charisma. You find yourself chewing more slowly, listening more closely, thinking more clearly. The conversations at his table are quiet but rich. Philosophers discuss the ethics of hunger. Jurists muse on food distribution laws. Someone raises the idea of a grain storage system in case of famine. Antoninus listens, nods, and by morning, there's a draft on his desk. His rule may be dull in headlines, but it feeds the people literally and figuratively. As the night draws to a close, dessert is served. Just fruit and nuts. Maybe a wedge of honeycomb. You feel light, alert, oddly content. There's no sense of spectacle, no need to perform. Just the steady heartbeat of an empire that, for once, isn't bleeding from its ears. Antoninus raises a simple ceramic cup, not gold, not encrusted with ruby sand, offers a toast. To good harvests, quiet minds, and meals that nourish more than the body. You raise yours in return, and for a brief, fig-sweet moment, Rome feels like it might last forever, because sometimes, the best emperors don't rule through extravagance or fear. Sometimes, they rule through lunch. You wake the next morning with the soft tang of honeycomb still lingering on your tongue, expecting more of Antoninus's calmand. Then you're jolted by the sound of a war horn echoing across the forum. Something is off. The air is thicker, heavier. The mood? Charged. And that's when it hits you. The grapes on the platter are already cut in half. The wine is pre-poured. The seat at the head of the table is vacant. But you know who it belongs to. Commodus, son of a philosopher king, child of a golden age, and now emperor with the subtlety of a sledgehammer made of roast lamb. With him, dining isn't about ritual or wisdom. It's about proving you can win a gladiator match and finish an entire suckling pig without pausing for breath. As you sit down, you prepare for a very different kind of meal, one that might end with dessert or dismemberment. Commodus strides in, dressed like Hercules. Not figuratively, literally. He's wearing a lion's skin, bare chest, club slung over one shoulder, a wreath perched on his carefully curled hair. You start to wonder if the salad is just for show, or if it too must be defeated in combat. The table groans under the weight of the feast. Game meat piled like trophies, platters of ostrich, boar, bear, and a suspiciously large bird that may or may not be extinct. Historians still argue whether Commodus truly ate exotic animals as a flex, or if the court invented half the menu to impress or scare him. Either way, your first bite tastes like ego and heavy seasoning. Tonight's theme? Commodus the Conqueror. Every course celebrates one of his personal victories, most of which were staged arena fights, where he killed already wounded animals or terrified slaves dressed as barbarians. One dish features Numidian tiger sausages, actually goat stuffed with fennel and pine nuts, but the label is dramatic. Another, Dacian heart tartare, is just spiced lamb, raw and bloody, garnished with edible gold. You chew with your mouth closed and your fear wide open. He raises a goblet and proclaims, "May Rome be fed by my strength," before chugging wine like a frat god. Someone claps. Someone else pretends not to see a roasted hedgehog roll off the table. The thing is, Commodus truly believes food should reflect strength his own, naturally. You're not eating for enjoyment. You're eating his audience. His meals are theatrical extensions of his narcissism. He doesn't serve you quail. He presents it, lifting the wing like a trophy, flexing slightly. Everything is too hot, too salted, too large. You slice into a roasted eel that's been molded into the shape of a scorpion. No one dares ask why. There's a story, possibly true, that he once demanded a dish shaped like every province he ruled. The cooks scrambled, carving mountains out of bread and sculpting rivers in mulled wine. He ate Italia first, because of course he did. Then Pannonia. Gaul took 3 hours to chew. And then there's his bizarre insistence on reenacting his arena kills through food. One platter arrives featuring a roast ostrich whose neck has been theatrically twisted. A small sign reads, "Slain by divine Hercules." You glance at Commodus. He grins and bites into the thigh with enough force to terrify the table. Somewhere, a senator nervously dabs his mouth and whispers, "I miss Antoninus." He also believes in victory sauces concoctions, so aggressively flavored they feel like punishment. Tonight's version involves mustard, cinnamon, anchovy paste, and why not? A splash of vinegar boiled in wine. It burns, it slaps, it lingers. Commodus dips everything in it. You follow suit, you survive. The centerpiece arrives with fanfare. A whole roasted stag decorated with arrows and fake blood. 2 slaves wheel it in while music swells from hidden lyres. Commodus stands, delivers a speech about hunting it with his own bare hands, then dramatically slices the haunch and serves it to his favorite gladiator/guest. You get a chunk of tail. It's rubbery and humiliating. And then comes the moment he's truly waited for, his kill. He personally selected, tracked, and slaughtered a wild boar last week. Or at least, that's what he says. The carcass was actually delivered by 6 men in the middle of the night, already trussed. He takes the first bite, then carves. You watch his arm flex with each slice, like he's reenacting a heroic epic. Historians debate how involved Commodus truly was in these feasts. Some claim he personally instructed the cooks, choosing ingredients and themes. Others argue that the kitchen simply adapted to his theatrics, cooking whatever would flatter him most. One fringe tale insists he once made a chef duel another, over whose recipe for honey-glazed partridge was better. The winner got a gold ring. The loser was assigned to sewer detail. Even the desserts are aggressive. A cherry tart shaped like a severed head, fig pudding served in a hollowed-out helmet, honeyed dates stuffed with almond teeth. You take a bite and feel something crunchy. It's a candied knuckle. Possibly. Hopefully. You don't ask. But what truly unnerves you is the silence. Not total, but weighted. No one jokes here. No one sips too loudly. This is not Joyet's survival. One senator fails to applaud a particularly violent carving display and finds his plate replaced with a single sad turnip. Message received. Despite the absurdity, there's a method beneath the madness. Commodus rules through domination, and food is one of his sharpest tools. Every bite forces you to remember who hunts and who's hunted, who gets the stag haunch and who gets the tail. He's not here to feed you, he's here to make you feel fed upon. And yet, occasionally, something slips through. A surprisingly tender course, a dish that's been prepared with real care. A bowl of lentils, simple and warming, like something out of a soldier's pack. Perhaps a nod to his father, Marcus Aurelius. Perhaps just a moment of nostalgia from a man who buried his soul beneath a lion's skin and a barrel of garum. You savor it, quietly. As the feast ends, Commodus throws his goblet into the fire. It shatters. The table applauds. And you? You wipe grease from your chin and stagger into the night, dizzy from spice, spectacle, and the strange weight of meat-based tyranny. You survived. Barely. But deep down, you know the empire didn't. You're still digesting the trauma of Commodus's carnivorous circus when the air changes again, thicker now, spiced, perfumed with something exotic. A breeze carries hints of cinnamon, cloves, dried roses, and underneath it all, the sharp tang of vinegar-soaked fish. You recognize the scent before you see the palace. You've entered the domain of the Severan dynasty, and tonight, the banquet is a melting pot of Rome's widening appetite. You walk beneath a golden archway into a courtyard glittering with lanterns, each one suspended from silk cords, dyed in deep purples and blood reds. The light flickers over silver trays, piled with pastries, shaped like lotus blossoms, and roasted meats rubbed in spice blends that make your eyes water. Somewhere nearby, incense smolders over a bed of cardamom and myrrh. Welcome to the world of Septimius Severus, and his kinware flavor isn't just a luxury, but a legacy. Septimius was born in North Africa, and he brought his palate with him when he became emperor. Unlike the plain feasts of Antoninus or the militarized menus of Trajan, his tables are alive with influence. You see dishes from Carthage, Alexandria, Syria, Cappadocia meals, seasoned by conquest, diplomacy, and personal taste. It's not just food, it's empire served hot. Tonight's main dish? Lamb braised in cumin and honey, slow roasted over pomegranate wood. You can smell the sweetness before you even sit down. The skin crackles under your fingers. Next to it, bowls of spiced lentils with coriander, chickpeas fried in olive oil and garlic, and flatbread still warm from the clay oven. You tear into one and burn your thumb slightly. Worth it. The emperor dines in a golden tunic, his beard oiled and braided, flanked by philosophers and generals, his wife Julia Domna seated beside him, her gaze sharp enough to slice through fig cake. Julia Domna, Syrian by birth, isn't just an empress, she's the culinary architect of this era. She oversees the kitchens, consults the cooks, and curates menus that blend East and West with surgical precision. There's a fringe rumor that she once wrote a cookbook under a pseudonym. Some say she invented fig vinegar reduction. Others say she weaponized it. Historians still argue whether the Severan era truly transformed Roman dining or simply exposed what had always been simmering beneath the surface, that the empire's palate was bigger than its politics. You bite into a dish of quail eggs marinated in mint and black pepper and realize they might be onto something. This isn't just experimentation, it's identity. The food reflects a new kind of Rome plural, hybrid, uncertain. The empire is no longer purely Latin. It's African, Middle Eastern, Greek, Thracian, and more. And nowhere is that more obvious than at the table. The dishes are layered, unexpected. You try a fish stew laced with orange peel and vinegar oddly floral, oddly perfect. Next, stuffed grape leaves, served with a dipping sauce so sour your eyes twitch. And then there's the saffron. So much saffron. Used in sauces, on rice, even sprinkled onto nuts like glitter. It smells like sunlight and power. It tastes like inheritance. The Severans imported in massive quantities. One ledger suggests that saffron spending under Caracalla nearly surpassed Rome's annual naval maintenance. Another claims that saffron was rubbed onto marble pillars to make the palace smell imperial. Ah yes, Caracalla, the son of Septimius, now emperor in his own right and with the subtlety of a wild boar in a tea shop. If Septimius refined the banquet, Caracalla weaponized it. His meals are just as spiced, but with more edge, more theater. You see dishes shaped like severed heads, lamb tongues stacked into pyramids, whole ducks presented with miniature swords jabbed into their backs. And Caracalla himself? He eats like a general on leave, fast, messy, with alarming focus. A platter of roasted locusts disappears in minutes. A bowl of pistachios vanishes with barely a blink. He insists on drinking wine from a Thracian horn, which spills constantly down his tunic, and when someone dares to chuckle, He throws a pomegranate at their face. Direct hit, you do not laugh. Yet for all his intensity, Caracalla is as obsessed with food as his mother. He just expresses it differently. He demands variety, consumes for dominance, and expects his chefs to create war on a plate. One cook reportedly served him a stew of venison and duck in a sour cherry glaze. Caracalla declared it too delicate, executed the recipe, and had the dish reissued with extra pepper and raw garlic. You try the revised version. It tastes like battle. There's a strange unity in this chaos. Unlike past emperors, the Severans are not trying to impose a single Roman identity. They're reflecting the messiness of their rule. Their cuisine is a mirror, vibrant, over-seasoned, inconsistent, and addictive. One senator once described their feasts as what you'd get if Rome fell in love with the Silk Road. He meant it as an insult. Everyone else clapped. One of the more peculiar dishes tonight is a jelly made from boiled rose petals and sheep's milk. It wobbles like a philosophical crisis but tastes oddly divine. There's also a new condiment made from fermented almonds and black salt, rumored to enhance memory. You dip your bread. Your memories remain terrible, but your mouth is happy. At the height of the meal, Julia Domna herself offers a toast. She holds a glass of date wine, dense and sweet, and speaks of unity, of the flavors that bind people more than swords ever could. There's applause, a few murmured prayers, and for a moment, the empire feels well, not stable, but at least deliciously complex. The final course is a platter of sweetmeats, dusted in powdered fig and sesame, shaped like zodiac signs. You're handed Sagittarius, which crumbles in your hand but melts on your tongue. Next to you, someone bites into Aries and loses a tooth. Balance, you suppose. As the banquet winds down, incense thickens, and musicians strike up a slow tune on the lyre. The lights dim slightly. Julia stands. Caracalla slouches. You feel your stomach sigh. The food, the scent, the noise, it's all a little overwhelming, but undeniably seductive. This isn't Rome trying to preserve tradition. This is Rome swallowing the world. You'd think after a banquet like that, where saffron flowed like water and lamb tongues were stacked like architectural columns, that Rome would pause for breath. But no, the feast keeps evolving. And now it's not just about abundance or spectacle. It's about legacy. Because after Caracalla's spiced chaos, someone has to preserve the recipe book. Enter the next generation of Severans, and with them, a culinary obsession so intense it feels almost archival. Tonight's dinner begins with silence. Not the tense kind, like under Domitian, but reverent silence. You're ushered into a dining hall where the walls are lined with amphorae, hundreds of them, each labeled, each sealed, not with wine, but with spices. Cumin from Cyrene, saffron from Tarsus, asafoetida from Media, clove-studded cinnamon bark from the Red Sea trade routes. It's a museum of taste. You half expect someone to charge admission. You're seated near the imperial spice ledger, an actual book, with vellum pages inked in neat handwriting, detailing spice shipments, harvest seasons, preferred ratios. The kitchen functions like a library crossed with a war room. Recipes are read aloud before execution. Dishes are timed with the precision of naval maneuvers. The emperor in charge tonight is Alexander Severus Young, cautious and deeply invested in making Roman cuisine not just exciting, but eternal. Historians describe him as bookish, dutiful, maybe a little soft, but no one denies he took food seriously. He wasn't interested in grand banquets for their own sake. He wanted a legacy of flavor, one that reflected his mixed heritage, his global curiosity, and let's be honest, this hope that if people loved what he fed them, they might delay plotting his downfall for another day or two. Tonight's theme is ancient and modern. Every dish comes in pairs. One based on an old Republican recipe, the other, its Severan. Era. Update. First, a bowl of pulse basic emmer wheat porridge, served with a drizzle of olive oil. Beside it, a reinvention. Emmer spiced with coriander, mixed with crushed apricots and roasted almonds. Both are good. The modern one is better. You say so aloud. The chef in the corner nods solemnly, like you've passed a test. There's a spread of grilled fish next unsalted and plain, just like the old military rations, and the other marinated in pomegranate juice, fennel, and sumac, grilled on cedar. The emperor says little, but watches you closely. You begin to suspect he enjoys food not just as sustenance or celebration, but as a message, a way of proving that Rome is both timeless and changing. The dishes grow more elaborate. A stuffed dormouse, crisped in a pan, and dusted with dried rose petals. A beef stew enriched with fermented fish sauce, thickened with crushed barley, finished with a dash of honey and vinegar. Every flavor tells a story, of old traditions layered with new ingredients, of imports once feared now embraced. And the spices. Alexander Severus employed a small army of buyers who scoured trade ports for rare seasonings. There's a fringe tale of a spice runner who traveled 15 months to find one specific strain of cassia bark from Arabia, only to discover the emperor had changed his mind and now preferred cinnamon grown on the slopes of Mount Etna. The poor man allegedly wept into his spice sacks and was later hired as a dessert consultant. There's even an imperial tasting panel, a group of chefs, scribes, and oddly enthusiastic philosophers who document every successful flavor combination. One scroll reads, "Clove in rabbit stew, too aggressive. Try dried basil." Another, garum and peach's accidental discovery. Surprisingly balanced. Serve with caution. These aren't just notes. They're history, recipes as policy. You sample a dish of boiled chicken glazed with lavender syrup. It's sweet, floral, a bit confusing, but it lingers. Next to it, a bowl of lentils with aged vinegar and crushed walnuts, earthy, comforting. The contrast is deliberate. Alexander Severus is trying to show you the empire as he sees it. One foot in tradition, one hand reaching toward innovation, and both eyes locked on the pantry. Yet beneath the order lies tension. The empire is fraying. Military rebellions bubble under the surface. Provinces grumble. The Senate rolls its collective eyes. And so the dining table becomes a place of control. A space where something inning can be preserved. Food becomes a tether. You don't have to like the emperor, but if you leave his dinner humming about the saffron-roasted figs, maybe you'll hesitate before sharpening your dagger. Julia Mamaea, the emperor's mother, often presides at these meals. A formidable figure, she's rumored to be the real architect behind the spice vaults and recipe scrolls. She also insists that every meal ends with preserved fruit from the imperial orchards, preferably quince, sliced thin and soaked in honey wine. You eat yours carefully, aware that this is less dessert and more statement. We endure, we preserve, we flavor history. One of the odder highlights tonight is a savory custard made from eggs, minced leeks, and powdered ginger. It's oddly soft, slightly spicy, and deeply divisive. You love it. The senator next to you gags politely. He's offered a second helping. That's the rule here. If you grimace, you get more. It's a game, but also a lesson. Alexander Severus even has plans, recorded ones, for the creation of an imperial cooking school, a place to train chefs not just in flavor, but philosophy. A good cook, one quote reads, must know the heart of a nation. Another, no empire survives on meat alone. It needs sauce. Unfortunately, the school never opens, but the dream lingers like garlic on a cutting board. Dessert arrives in the form of candied pine nuts wrapped in grape leaves and dipped in date syrup. You lick your fingers. It's sticky, crunchy, aromatic. And somewhere in the background, a scribe scribbles notes on your reaction. You've become part of the record, another mouthful in the story of Rome. As the lights dim, incense curls in the air again. This time it's spiced with cardamom and laurel. The emperor rises. He says little, just nods. The meal ends, not with applause or toasts, but with scribes collecting their notes, servers retrieving empty trays, and a subtle exhale from guests who somehow feel they've just dined with the future. And as you walk into the night, the flavors still buzzing on your tongue, you realize this emperor doesn't want to be remembered in marble. He wants to be remembered in spice. You walk through the twilight gardens of Rome, still tasting the ghost of candied pine nuts and clove, when the wind changes again. No more balanced menus. No more lavender-glazed chicken. You don't just smell dinner now, you feel it. A pulse in the air. A strange, sticky sweetness rising from somewhere unnatural. You look up and realize that the stars overhead have been replaced by rose petals, and they're falling everywhere. Onto the cushions, into the wine, into your sandals. Welcome to the banquet of Elagabalus, Rome's high priest of absurdity, chaos incarnate, and the only emperor who could turn a dinner party into a psychedelic opera of the senses. Elagabalus doesn't sit at the head of the table. He floats through it, draped in robes stitched with gold thread and embroidered moons, perfumed so heavily that bees follow him in slow orbit. Tonight's table isn't rectangular or rounded spirals, winding like a snake through the palace courtyard, weaving among flower-strewn fountains and marble nymphs holding baskets of pomegranate seeds. You don't just dine here. You submit. The food is a dare. Every dish arrives under a golden dome, lifted with a flourish by dancers not servants, who wear nothing but strategically placed feathers and eternal smiles. The first course? Mouse-stuffed olives. Real mouse. Tiny, roasted, their little feet curled up like forgotten dreams. You try one. It's crisp. And then it gets weirder. A soup appears, frothy and pink. No one tells you what it is. You sip and guess. Rose petals? Fermented milk? Figs? The emperor watches your reaction closely, then claps. A shower of glitter falls from the ceiling. The man 2 cushions down from you sneezes, and is politely smothered with a silk napkin. Everyone pretends not to notice. Elagabalus, crowned in ivy, raises a cup of wine-dyed turquoise. He announces, in a voice as high and dreamy as an Aeolian harp, that tonight's theme is transformation. You eat a sausage wrapped in gold foil, shaped like a fish, then a pastry designed to look like a snail, but filled with mint custard and crushed pepper. Every bite is misdirection. Nothing is what it seems. You begin to mistrust your own tongue. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's banquets were acts of spiritual expression, psychological unraveling, or elaborate cosmic performance art. Maybe they were all three. His food wasn't nourishment, it was ritual. He believed himself to be the earthly vessel of the sun god Elagabal, and his dinners, divine theater. You don't eat for sustenance, you eat to transcend. The walls shimmer with tapestries, woven to reflect candlelight in moving waves. Your wineglass refills itself. The cushions beneath you feel suspiciously like marshmallows. A server presents you with a roasted pheasant stuffed with pearls. Actual pearls. You crunch one by accident and wonder if your teeth can be declared enemies of the state. A rumor wafts down the table like incense. Last week, Elagabalus held a dinner where all the food was white albino peacocks, boiled turnips, milk custards, even dyed bread. Another banquet was entirely red. Beet soup, blood sausages, pomegranate, glazed goose, and guests required to wear crimson robes and speak only in verse. Tonight, you're under a theme of transmutation. Every dish has to look like something else. Every flavor must lie to you. You're handed a grape that bursts into fish sauce when bitten, a cake that smells like myrrh but tastes like garlic, a candied insect, possibly, and then the petals. Again. This time not just scattered, dumped. Hundreds of pounds of rose petals cascade from hidden alcoves above the spiral table. You're knee-deep in them. You blow them out of your wine. A senator disappears briefly beneath the drift. Someone pulls him out by his wig. Elagabalus giggles and announces, "The gods are pleased." One of the fringe stories claims he once smothered a guest beneath flower petals, entirely by accident. Or maybe not. Historians are divided on whether it was murder or just an unfortunate allergy attack. Either way, the message was clear. Come hungry, but don't get too comfortable. And you do start to see the cracks beneath the velvet. The laughter is manic. The food, while beautiful, starts to turn. Sweet things become cloying. Meats arrive either frozen or too soft. Your senses are overwhelmed. The scent of cinnamon fights the lavender. The sound of a lyre duet clashes with a drum solo. A plate of jelly shaped like a senator's face jiggles a little too realistically. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there's a strange sincerity. Elagabalus truly believes in the power of food to transcend the ordinary. He isn't trying to impress you, he's trying to transform you. His kitchen is an altar, his wine, a potion, his pies, prophetic. He's said to have employed astrologers as menu planners. Before each meal, his advisors would consult the stars to determine which ingredients were cosmically appropriate. One evening, after Mercury entered retrograde, the kitchen was banned from using lentils for an entire month. Bread was cut into star shapes. Pigs were roasted over eucalyptus because Mars demanded cleaner smoke. You're not sure if the astrologers actually believed this or just enjoyed the free wine. And the wasto, the glorious, absurd waste. Elagabalus would serve dishes only to throw them away uneaten, not out of boredom, but symbolism. A goose stuffed with sapphires? Gone. A loaf of bread carved into a miniature temple? Devoured by monkeys before it reached the table. He fed more to animals than people, including one time, allegedly, when the royal dogs ate better than the entire Senate. Dessert arrives on a floating tray, pushed by servants hidden under the floor. It's a tower of honey-drenched almond cakes, shaped like zodiac constellations. You receive Gemini. Your neighbor gets Taurus. The emperor gets the sun. Naturally. He bites into it, honey dripping down his chin, and declares, "We eat not to survive, but to become." Then he falls backward onto a couch and demands someone recite poetry backwards while playing a lyre made of glass. You stare into your cake. It blinks. Maybe you blink. Hard to say. The evening's pulse has reached its peak. Wine is everywhere. Perfume chokes the air. You begin to feel that you're no longer at a banquet, but inside one wallowed by it, digested by someone else's dream. Eventually, the emperor falls asleep beneath a rose silk canopy, clutching a gold-plated apricot. The musicians slow, the servers retreat, and the table, now half collapsed under the weight of edible sculpture, finally sighs. You stagger away, feet coated in syrup and petals, unsure if you've just experienced a meal, a séance, or an interdimensional ritual. Probably all three. And as you slip into the cool night air, the stars above seem dull in comparison to the ones you ate. You escape the rose-petal vortex of Elagabalus's edible fever dream with a head full of syrup and a digestive system that may never fully trust you again. But Rome doesn't sleep, and neither, apparently, does its appetite. Because now the rhythm of boots on cobblestones grows louder, more measured. The incense fades. The wine dries on your sleeves. You blink and find yourself marching, not lounging, not feasting, but moving, alongside a man who eats faster than some emperors wage war. This is Aurelian, the restorer of the world, the soldier's soldier, the man who reforged a broken empire while subsisting on the kind of food that would make Elagabalus weep into his jasmine pudding. There are no rose petals here, no acrobats serving pudding mid-cartwheel, just bread, meat, discipline, and hunger that walks beside you like an old friend with blistered feet. Dinner with Aurelian isn't an invitation, it's a ration. You sit not at a polished table, but on a log, a flat rock, sometimes nothing at all. Your plate is your lap. Your utensils? Your fingers or a knife that also opens tents and possibly enemy skulls. The food is hot if you're lucky, salted if there's time, and always, always practical. You chew with purpose. This isn't indulgence. It's fuel. Historians generally agree that Aurelian's court meals were spare and consistent with his military values: bread, dried meat, olives, lentils. Occasionally, if the roads were good and the foragers competent, maybe some wild onions or cheese. But even in the palace, when he had time and a roof over his head, Aurelian reportedly kept his meals soldier simple. It was part of his brand. Rome didn't need a gourmet. Rome needed grit. Tonight, you sit around a campfire on the Danube frontier. The emperor is eating the same stew as his men: barley thickened with dried beans, slices of hard sausage, and a dollop of garum stirred in for salt and punch. It's ugly. It's brown. It's perfect. You dip your bread into it and feel the warmth travels straight to your bones. There's a rhythm to eating in Aurelian's world. Meals are timed, not with clocks, but with daylight and distance. A meal should take no longer than the time it takes to retie a sandal, chew efficiently, talk minimally, laugh only when no one's watching. When it rains, eat under your cloak. When it snows, warm your food with your breath. When you're under siege, dry rations, cold water, and the promise of something hot when the enemy runs out of arrows. One of the fringe stories claims Aurelian once banned figs from his camp after a soldier slipped on one and missed a spear toss. Another says he personally executed a cook who tried to serve lamb glazed in honey during a winter march. "Food is not a poem," he allegedly growled. "It is a tool." You take that to heart when someone offers you a charred turnip and you nod like it's caviar. Despite his severity, there's a kind of camaraderie in Aurelian's approach to food. He eats beside his officers, shares his rations with wounded soldiers, refuses any plate he doesn't see prepared. Once, after a victorious battle, he allowed his men to roast an entire ox. Not for show but to feed everyone equally. No first cuts for nobles, no silver platters for generals. Just meat, smoke, and silence broken only by chewing. His imperial banquets, when he holds them, are only slightly more elaborate. In Rome, he still eats modestly: roasted poultry, boiled barley, a salad of vinegar-dressed greens. Wine is always watered. Servants are discouraged from bowing too low. The silverware is plain. The bread is dense. No imported spices, no gold-dusted fruit, and no rose petals. Ever. Yet even in this minimalist world, there are quirks. Aurelian reportedly had a fondness for roasted chestnut shard and split open over open flame. He'd eat them slowly, one by one, during war council meetings, often offering them to generals mid-debate as a gesture of approval. If you got a chestnut, your plan was good. If you didn't, consider revising your map and maybe your will. And garum, of course. The ubiquitous fermented fish sauce. Aurelian carried his own flask of it, literally, a small amphora tied to his saddle. Some joked he would rather forget his sword than his condiments. One of his commanders once swapped it out for a cheaper blend. Aurelian noticed instantly. That commander spent the next month overseeing latrine digging duty in Germania. There's something oddly comforting about eating with him. The rules are clear. The flavors may be blunt, but they're honest. Every bite reminds you that you're part of something: an army, a mission, a world that needs rebuilding. There's no guessing, no illusions. You know exactly what's on your plate and why. And that, in its way, is a kind of feast. Evenings end early. After eating, the emperor reads dispatches, maps, and grain reports. He sometimes scribbles recipe notes in the marginstiny edits to improve efficiency. Less barley, more lentils. Swap olive oil for fat drippings in cold weather. These are not the whims of a gourmand. These are the calculations of a man trying to feed 1,000,000 mouths without breaking the treasury. One night, after marching through a storm and eating half-frozen bread by a half-dead fire, Aurelian looks at his plate, shrugs, and says, "It's not much, but it's ours." The soldiers laugh. It's the closest he's come to a toast all week. You raise your crust and clink it gently against another. It's hard, loud, but oddly satisfying. And then, as the fire dies and the stew pot scrapes empty, you wrap yourself in a wool cloak and realize something profound. Not every feast needs peacocks. Some just need calories. Not every emperor needs an ego made of custard. Some just need to move faster than hunger. Because for Aurelian, food is not about display. It's about endurance. You awaken in a vegetable garden. No, really. There's a cabbage leaf stuck to your cheek. Bees hum over wild herbs. Somewhere nearby, someone is singing not triumphantly, not mournfully, but contentedly. You follow the smell of damp earth and garlic oil through a breezy stone courtyard, and find him, the man himself. Diocletian, retired emperor. Former master of the known world, currently crouching beside a tomato vine like it owes him rent. It's not what you expect. This is a man who once ruled with iron precision, who restructured the empire, split it in two, created the tetrarchy, and probably knew the precise number of lentils in the imperial pantry at any given moment. And yet, here he is shumming to himself while holding a leek. You're not in Rome anymore. You're in Diocletian's villa in Split, far from the Senate, the barracks, and the boiling drama of court life. The palace is grand, yes, but not gilded. The grandeur is stone and sea, garden walls, and sun-warmed terraces. There are no murals of divine ancestors devouring grapes. Instead, there's a fig tree shading a modest table. On it, a bowl of olives, a wedge of cheese, some barley bread. This is what retirement looks like when you've run an empire and decided, finally, that you'd rather be planting onions. You sit, and Diocletian joins you with a faint grin. He cuts the cheese with a practiced hand, then tears a piece of bread in half and offers it without ceremony. "Try the cabbage," he says. You do. It's buttery, braised with garlic and just a hint of vinegar. Humble. Honest. Kind of perfect. Historians still puzzle over Diocletian's abdication. No emperor had ever willingly stepped down before. Was it exhaustion, disillusionment, chronic illness? Whatever the cause, his post-imperial life became legend, and not just because of politics. It's the cabbages, the gardens. The fact that, when asked to return to power years later during a crisis, he famously refused and said, "If you could show the cabbage I planted with my own hands, you wouldn't ask me to take up the burden again." The man didn't just eat vegetables, he used them as policy. That might be an exaggeration, but here, now, with bees buzzing and herbs drying in bundles from the rafters, you start to understand the appeal. This is a man who once balanced the chaos of an empire and now balances his lunch with a drizzle of olive oil and a pinch of crushed coriander. Today's meal is simple but crafted. Boiled eggs with black pepper, leeks stewed in white wine, lentil salad with chopped herbs and pickled radish. There's no meat on the table either by design or by seasonal shortage. Instead, there's fresh goat cheese wrapped in fig leaves and a basket of dried apricots. So sweet, you wonder if the sun itself came down and rolled in sugar. One of the fringe stories says Diocletian experimented with growing saffron and garlic together in the same plot, believing their complementary aromas would enhance each other's flavor. Another tale insists he invented a method for drying figs so they wouldn't attract ants, a humble obsession for a man who once controlled 30 legions. But you believe it. You really do. Because nothing about this meal feels like a performance. It's the first dinner in a long time that doesn't demand anything of you. No loyalty, no applause, no toast to immortality. Just another bite, another shared smile, another spoonful of peace. Still, Diocletian is no soft gardener. Beneath the linen robe and warm bread, you catch flashes of the old emperor. He talks about grain quotas, about price edicts and food distribution. You remember, this is the man behind the edict on maximum prices, a sweeping attempt to control inflation across the empire. He regulated the price of everything from wheat to wine, toy scabbage. It didn't exactly work. Black markets blossomed like spoiled grapes. But it was ambitious, practical, a bit disparate, entirely Diocletian. He believed food was the empire's backbone, not statues, not temples, not legions, just full stomachs. He once wrote that hunger breeds rebellion faster than taxes ever could. You chew your bread and nod. That tracks. A plate arrives flatbreads topped with mashed fava beans, drizzled with oil, and sprinkled with fresh thyme. It's so rustic you feel like you should be wearing sandals made of bark. And yet, it's beautiful. The kind of thing you'd pay 14 denarii for in a trendy Roman alleyway with minimalist seating and terrible acoustics. Diocletian eats slowly, purposefully. He talks about the rhythm of plants, of watering schedules, and shade patterns. You start to see that he hasn't abandoned power. He's just transplanted it. Empire was a wild, uncontrollable beast. A garden is orderly, predictable, generous, if treated right. He's still managing cycles. Only now, it's not politics, it's parsley. There's a story that once, during a thunderstorm, Diocletian stood barefoot in the garden, arms crossed, daring the weather to ruin his kale. You don't doubt it. There's another story, likely false, but irresistible, that he wrote a gardening manual under a pseudonym, detailing compost strategies, and which vegetables respond best to music. Again, you wouldn't be surprised. Dessert is stewed apples with honey and cinnamon. No fanfare, just fruit made soft by time and care. You eat with your hands, so does he. Somewhere, a bird lands on the edge of the table and hops once before stealing a grape. Diocletian grunts and flicks a seed at it. That one's been watching me since March, he mutters. He pours a final glass of wine light, slightly sour, and probably from his own vines. No toast, just a nod. The sun sets behind him, casting shadows through the fig trees and across the worn grooves in the stone floor where tables have been dragged, chairs scooted, and sandals scuffed. You sit in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't press, doesn't ache, doesn't need to be filled. And then, he says something so soft you almost miss it. I used to believe Rome needed me. Turns out, it just needed lunch delivered on time. You smile. He doesn't. Because he's already gone back to pruning the basil. You brush the last basil leaf from your sleeve, the taste of stewed apple still sweet on your tongue, and begin to move again, this time towards something new, but unmistakably familiar. The marble arches return. So do the whispers in the hallways, the flicker of torchlight on polished floors, and the sound of sandals shuffling in formation. But something's changed. The prayers before meals are different. The toasts now include a different name. And just before dinner is served, you're asked to bow your head, not to Jupiter or Mars, but to the God of heaven. You've stepped into the age of Constantine. Gone are the perfumed nights of Elagabalus. Gone, too, are Diocletian's cabbage-washed afternoons. This is a new empire. Or at least, Constantine wants it to be. And he's rewriting the menu alongside everything else. Tonight's banquet is stately, controlled. There are fewer dancers, more clerics. The music is gentler, the pacing more formal. You recline at a table set not just with food, but with ideology. The bread is crusty and white. The wine is red and watered. And yes, Your host has recently converted to Christianity, but no one knows exactly what that means for dinner yet. Constantine arrives in purple robes, wearing a golden diadem that gleams more like an icon than a crown. His presence is quiet power, neither flamboyant nor understated, but certain. He greets guests with a nod, not a roar. And when he sits, you feel it. Not the weight of tyranny or the chill of paranoia, but something firmer, settled, intentional. The food is modest compared to earlier emperors. Roasted fowl, seasoned with garlic and herbs. Beans stewed in olive oil and leeks. Dates and fresh grapes. The flavors are earthy, deliberate, and designed to reflect a turning point. Constantine is still feeding an empire, but now he wants it to feel blessed. Historians still argue whether Constantine's shift in dining style was driven by faith or politics. Was it a personal conviction, or a masterstroke of unification in a fracturing empire? Whatever the case, his court meals reflect the changing atmosphere. Fewer orgies, more sermons. You're not expected to gorge, you're expected to listen. Before the first course, a prayer is offered. A simple invocation of thanks. It's short, gentle, but it lands like a stone in a pond. Constantine bows his head, and the room follows. The meal begins. You dip bread into a light lentil soup, flavored with coriander and vinegar. Next, a slice of roasted lamb arrives not drenched in sauces, but adorned with rosemary and restraint. There's fish, too, poached. A nod, perhaps, to new symbols. The servants are quieter now, less peacock feathers, more linen, less showing off, more structure. But don't be fooled, this isn't austerity. Constantine is still emperor. The silver is polished. The goblets shine. The bread is hot, not stale. Everything tastes like money. But now, the wealth is cloaked in humility, prestige wrapped in piety. The grapes you eat were grown in Sicily and carted across land by oxen, whose hooves were probably blessed by a bishop. One of the fringe stories says Constantine once banned the consumption of swan at imperial banquets because he felt it too decadent, too pagan in spirit. Another tale claims he had a brief obsession with fig compote as a metaphor for the sweetness of spiritual rebirth. Whether symbolic or coincidental, fig desserts do seem to appear more often now. You eat yours slowly. It's thick and warm, and just sweet enough to feel holy. The wine is lighter than usual. Some say he cut back as a nod to Christian sobriety. Others claim he preferred it that way because he hated being drunk in front of the clergy. Either way, you're allowed only one cup before the servers quietly stop refilling. There's no debauchery tonight. No grape-throwing senators. No juggling eels. The conversation has changed too. Less about hunting, more about providence. One bishop shares a parable over roast duck. A court advisor mentions that fasting before a feast heightens gratitude. You nod politely while reaching for a third slice of bread. Gratitude, you think, is best expressed through chewing. Yet Constantine is no monk. He still enjoys food. You can see it in his face when the roasted chickpeas arrive, crisped in oil and tossed with sea salt. He pops a handful, then chuckles at something his son whispers. There's joy here, just tempered, refined, redirected. He's also practical. Constantine knows that empire runs on full bellies. His grain programs, his public distributions, his rebuilding of food supply routes, after wars and riots, all of it, is part of the same meal. You eat, but so does the city. Bread is still the contract between ruler and ruled. It's just now blessed before being served. Later in the evening, dessert is carried in with quiet reverence. A fig tart shaped like a cross. Almond cakes molded into doves. The symbolism is thick enough to chew, but the flavor holds up. You eat the dove head first and hope no one notices. The honey is from Cappadocia, the almonds from Egypt. The message? the entire empire still comes to the emperor's table. There's a moment of silence near the end of the meal. Constantine stands, lifts his cup not for Bacchus or Jupiter, but for the Almighty, whose wisdom has delivered Rome. No thunder, no lightning, just that, a toast to order, to faith, to whatever comes next. And then, just like that, he leaves. No post-meal games, no dancing, no garden orgies, just footsteps and the faint scent of frankincense in his wake. You sit quietly, finishing your tart, feeling the weight of a new Rome pressing into your shoulders. The food was good, subtle, meaningful. You didn't laugh. You didn't fear for your life. You simply ate. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point, because Constantine's table doesn't feed ambition or madness. It feeds a vision. You wake up the next day, belly still full of sanctified lentils and fig tarts, but the hum of reverence has already faded into a new sound, the scratch of quills, the rustle of scrolls, the very faint slosh of bean stew being ladled into earthenware bowls. You're in a different Rome now, or what's left of it. The West has started to crumble like a poorly baked honey cake, and the court is quieter, more anxious, like a kitchen where someone forgot to add salt. The emperors still eat, of course, but with barbarians knocking and legions dwindling, it's not so much a banquet as it is, well, meal prep under siege. Tonight, you're invited to dine with Valentini and I. The name alone sounds like it should come with a side of roasted chestnuts and a 2-hour lecture on discipline. And that's pretty accurate. Valentinian is a soldier emperor, through and throughless garum, more grit. If Constantine introduced restraint for ideological reasons, Valentinian tightens the belt because there's no choice. The empire is fractured, hungry, and very much in survival mode. Still, he does feed his court. You're ushered into a chamber lined with wool tapestries that don't quite cover the draft. The fire crackles more out of obligation than warmth. The table is plain wood, carved but worn, and the cutlery has seen better decades. A tray arrives. It holds a bowl of thick millet porridge, a few stewed lentils, some boiled cabbage, and a single dried plum that might have once dreamed of being juicy. It's humble fare but not tasteless. You take a bite. The millet is buttery, the cabbage tangy with vinegar. The plum, once chewed, releases a whisper of sweetness. Valentinian eats with his sleeves rolled, cutting his meat with the same blade he probably used last week to yell at a tax collector. He doesn't smile, he doesn't offer toasts, but he does eat. Slowly, methodically. Historians still debate whether Valentinian's simple eating was out of virtue or necessity. Some argue he valued frugality as a statement of strength. Others say the treasury was so depleted that feasts simply weren't an option. Either way, the days of 20-course peacock buffets are gone. Tonight, the most decadent thing on the table is a roasted onion rubbed with salt and thyme. You savor it like it's ambrosia. Conversation is minimal. The emperor prefers to listen to grain reports, military updates, rumors of Gothic movements. Between bites, he grunts or nods. Occasionally, he raises a brow at an overcooked turnip but keeps eating anyway. A fringe account claims that Valentinian once refused to eat during a famine until his soldiers were fed first. Another insists he yelled at a cook for presenting a tray with 3 cheeses instead of 1. Cheese inflation, he called it. Dessertif, you can call it, that is a bowl of warm spiced wine, and a thin oat cake sweetened with date paste. The cake is dry, but the wine helps. You chew, you sip, you chew again, and somehow, it all feels right. The empire may be shrinking, but at least someone still remembered dessert. By now, you notice that meals in Valentinian's court serve a different function. They're not about luxury or ritual or faith. They're about continuity, a kind of edible defiance. The empire might wobble, but the bread still bakes. The lentils still boil. You sit among tired generals and cautious clerks, all eating the same stew, and it feels like glue holding everything together. And yet even here there are strange quirks. One dish tonight features smoked trout, delicately seasoned with mountain herbs. It's out of place among the boiled beans and turnip mash, and you raise a brow. Valentinian notices and explains curtly that it was sent as tribute from a loyal Pannonian governor. He respects loyalty, even if it tastes fishy. You nod and chew. It's surprisingly tender. There's another oddity, a jar of pickled carrots served with a flourish by a particularly enthusiastic servant. You ask why. Turns out they were grown from a seed stock preserved since Diocletian's time. A symbolic dish. We remember where we came from, someone whispers. You eat too. As the meal winds down, the emperor wipes his mouth with a linen square that's been patched and repatched. It's not laziness, it's a statement. Nothing is wasted. Not fabric, not food, not Rome. There's no music, no after-dinner games, just the slow shuffling of people rising from their benches, stretching creaky limbs, and heading back to duties that rarely pause. You follow suit, the warmth of stew still in your belly, your fingers stained with onion and determination. Later that night, you wander the palace kitchens. They're smaller now, less gilded, more practical. The cooks wear plain tunics and speak softly, their hands rough from grinding grain and scrubbing soot. One offers you a scrap of leftover oat bread. You accept. It's hard, but it fills you. You notice a ledger near the fire rink stained, edges curling. Inside are records of food stores, spice reserves, barley counts. Nothing decorative, just survival. The last entry reads, "Enough for 34 days. If no rain, if no war." You close the book. Because even as emperors fade and enemies approach, the porridge still bubbles, the wine still warms. The empire still eats. Not like it used to, but enough. You leave Valentinian's court under a gray dawn sky, the kind that turns marble into ash and makes even fresh bread look sullen. The air is thick, with the metallic scent of impending doomer. Maybe that's just the lingering aftertaste of his oatcakes. Either way, Rome isn't dead yet. It limps forward, powered by habit, nostalgia, and a kind of weary defiance that clings like olive oil on tunics. And you, lucky you, are about to break bread with someone who carries that weariness like a second skin. Theodosius I. Tonight's banqueter, what passes for one in these final chapters of Rome's long, messy sagas, all about division. You can feel it in the room. Theodosius, the last man to rule both East and West as a single emperor, presides over a table that feels like two dinners stitched together by protocol and barley soup. One end whispers in Greek, the other mutters in Latin. And in the middle sits a man who just wants everyone to eat without stabbing each other with bread knives. Theodosius isn't flashy. He's a Spaniard by birth, practical by temperament, and perpetually 5 seconds from a migraine. He doesn't want drama. He wants order. And yet, his dinner table is a battlefield in miniature East versus West, tradition versus reform, pagans versus bishops, and you, awkwardly sandwiched between a senator who won't stop quoting Virgil and a monk who keeps murmuring about abstinence between bites of stuffed dormouse. The food reflects the split. The Western plates are familiar. Barley porridge, salted pork, boiled greens with vinegar, dense rye bread. Comfort food for an empire on the decline. The Eastern offerings, meanwhile, shimmer with spice. Cumin, laced lentils, honey, glazed eggplant, pomegranate chicken, so sweet it makes your teeth ache. You dip a crust of bread into both zones, trying to stay politically neutral while chewing like a diplomat. The emperor eats sparingly. He favors the simpler dishes, some say out of piety. Others say he just had chronic stomach issues. Either way, he pushes chickpeas around his plate with a worn spoon, while bishops argue across the olives about the latest edicts. Theodosius tries to redirect the conversation to military logistics, but nobody's listening. So he sighs, drinks his watered wine, and munches on a dried fig like it's the only thing in the room that hasn't betrayed him. Historians still argue whether Theodosius's love of humble meals was genuine or strategic. Some claim he believed in leading by example. Others think he just didn't care for luxury. But one consistent detail pops up. He always made sure his servants ate well. There are accounts of him checking on their portions, asking if they had enough meat or bread. Not exactly emperor behavior, but then again, nothing about this era is behaving. You're handed a dish of lamb stewed with garlic and bitter herbs. It's hearty, heavy, and surprisingly good. Someone mentions it's based on a Syrian recipe brought by one of the Eastern cooks. The senator beside you scoffs and says Rome doesn't need foreign flavors. The monk mutters something about gluttony and nudges his wine behind a jug. You, meanwhile, have another bite. Theodosius suddenly raises his cup. Not high. Just enough. Everyone hushes. He says nothing grand. Just, we eat while we still can, and we share while we're still one. A toast both hopeful and grim. A few nods follow. The monk claps once, then looks embarrassed. The senator starts crying into his lentils. After the toast, dessert arrives. Two kinds, of course. West offers a fig-stuffed pastry, dry and cracked at the edges, but filled with nostalgia. East provides a syrup-soaked sponge cake infused with orange blossom water. You take one of each and marvel at the empire's taste buds, still managing to cooperate better than its politicians. Somewhere near the kitchen, a musician plays a soft tune on a lyre. Not a celebration, more of a lullaby for tired empires. The fire crackles. The bread disappears. A steward pours the last of the wine. Theodosius leans back, closes his eyes for a moment, and mutters something about reorganizing the grain tax. You pretend you didn't hear it. It's dinner, after all. A fringe account claims Theodosius once commissioned a massive symbolic cake during a unity celebration, a layered dessert meant to represent the whole empire. From Hispania to Mesopotamia, it allegedly collapsed under its own weight before reaching the table. Some say it was an omen, others say the kitchen just wasn't up to code. As the meal winds down, a small silver dish is passed around. Candied dates rolled in sesame and pine nuts. You pop one into your mouth and feel the sugar spark against your tired tongue. It's good, almost too good for a night like this. You glance at Theodosius. He catches your eye and shrugs. Even in decline, he says, we deserve a little sweetness. You nod. He's not wrong. Then he stands. There's no proclamation. No curtain call. He just walks away, back into the shadows of administration, tax reforms, and theological feuds. You remain seated, finishing your wine, watching the wax dribble down a half-melted candle, and wondering how much longer dinners like this will happen. The empire is still alive, but so is dessert. And for now, that's enough. The coals are still warm from Theodosius's strange, half-unifying banquet when the plates begin to split for good. You blink, and suddenly there are two empires. East and West with borders. More stubborn than your uncle's opinion on raisins in bread. And like any good family breakup, there's division not just in politics, but in dinner. You find yourself invited to a feast, or perhaps a negotiation disguised as one, in a world where meals are meant to maintain the illusion that everything's fine, especially when it absolutely isn't. Tonight's host is Honorius, son of Theodosius, ruler of the Western Empire, and possibly the most reluctant dinner guest in all of Roman history. The man looks perpetually uncomfortable, like someone's about to ask him to pick up the check. You dine with him in Ravenna, where he moved the capital far from the noise and unpredictability of Rome proper. It's wetter here, quieter, and the food, well, Let's just say it's seen better centuries. Honorius sits stiffly, draped in silk he didn't choose, poking at a plate he probably didn't request. His cooks try, bless them. The soup has barley and lentils, the bread is warm, and there's even a roasted hen rubbed with salt and thyme. But something feels off. You can't put your finger on it. Maybe it's the guards pacing outside. Maybe it's the ghost of Rome breathing down everyone's neck. Or maybe it's the fact that Visigoths are marching toward the gates, and the emperor's biggest concern is whether his pet chicken is still alive. Yes, that part's true. Historians agree Honorius had a favorite chicken named Roma, no lessened when told the city of Rome had fallen in 410 CE. He reportedly gasped, thinking someone had killed his bird. When assured she was fine, he sighed in relief and went back to eating. Scholars still debate whether the story is literal or satirical, but either way, it's too delicious to ignore. And so is dinner, sort of. You chew a crust of hard bread while the conversation drifts between imperial tax woes, food shortages, and vague hopes that Constantinople will send help. No one seems to notice when your bowl of cabbage stew is refilled. The wine is decent Greek, of course, shipped over before the ports became unpredictable. A bishop at the far end of the table murmurs something about divine punishment. A senator rolls his eyes so hard, you hear it. The room's tension is matched by its menu. Everything is modest, yet slightly too polished. Like someone wanted to appear humble but accidentally used imported pepper. The meat is underseasoned. The figs are bruised. The whole meal feels like a ceremonial shrug. You imagine the cooks whispering in the back, "Don't make it too good, we don't want anyone thinking we're still rich." And yet, here it is. The performance of empire. A plate of boiled carrots arranged in a laurel wreath. A fish molded to resemble a map of the Mediterranean. Someone even tried to shape cheese into a miniature aqueduct. You stab the cheese with your knife. It collapses. You chew. It squeaks. Fitting. Across the empire, in Constantinople, it's a different story. The Eastern court still dines like the gods are watching. You hear tales of glittering banquets where Emperor Arcadius, Honorius's brother, presides over golden plates and sweetened lamb wrapped in fig leaves. Their cooks have spices. Their cellars have depth. Their servers still glide. But over here in the West, dinner creaks. Still, food has its power. Despite the grim politics, the meal functions. You eat. You drink. You sit beside officials who'd rather be anywhere else but know that sharing a table keeps the illusion of unity alive. You break bread with a man who governs more through inertia than ambition. Honorius may not inspire confidence, but he does maintain routine, and sometimes routine is all that stands between survival and collapse. One of the more obscure accounts says Honorius developed a fondness for boiled chickpeas, specifically those soaked overnight in vinegar. He claimed they soothed his stomach and, more importantly, required no spice imports. You try some. They're surprisingly pleasant. Tart, soft, honest. You make a mental note. Apocalypse chickpeas tolerable. There's even dessert barely. A single baked apple, hollowed and filled with crushed nuts and honey. It's soft, slightly sour, but it melts on your tongue like a last fond memory of autumn. The emperor eats one too, methodically slicing it with a dull knife and pausing between bites like he's trying to remember something important. Maybe it's where he left his chicken. Maybe it's how Rome used to taste. The meal ends without ceremony. No toast, no fanfare, just a shared glance around the room, a collective breath, and the quiet scraping of chairs. You rise, full but not satisfied, and step into the dusk. The torches flicker. The air carries the smell of salt and moss. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world shifts. And yet, you did eat. And the bread, at least, was warm. The door creaks shut behind you, cutting off the hollow sounds of Honorius's awkward banquet, and you step into a deeper, quieter, strange, thinned version of Rome, where the shadows seem heavier than the stones. The Western Empire is wobbling like an overripe fig. But the East? The East still shimmers. And so, your sandals lead you eastward now, toward Constantinople, where the kitchens burn hotter and the politics stew deeper. Here, you dine with Theodora and Justinian. Now this is dinner as theater again. But not the kind of wild, gilded chaos you remember from Elagabalus's perfume-drenched hallucinations. No, Theodora's table is calculated. Every fig has a purpose. Every honey-glazed quail a message. And at the center of it all, she sits not just as empress, but as co-curator of the imperial palate. You arrive in the great palace, where mosaic floors gleam under lamplight, and the very scent of the hall makes your stomach flinch in anticipation. Cinnamon, roasted lamb, lemon and saffron, and the faint hum of something sweet caramelizing in a copper pan. It's all here. Luxury hasn't disappeared, it's just become sharper, like a dagger wrapped in silk. Justinian, stern and beardless, speaks softly as he slices into a pastry shaped like a fish. It flutters with layers of phyllo and glistens with honey. Theodora, in contrast, doesn't eat much. She picks at olives, sips wine with a knowing smirk, and observes the table like a general surveying a battlefield. You quickly understand. This meal is not a feast, it's strategy with silverware. The food is exquisite. Grilled lamb seasoned with coriander and garlic, topped with a reduction of pomegranate and wine. Dolmas grape leaves stuffed with rice, pine nuts, and minced herbs arrive on golden trays shaped like laurel crowns. There's barley flatbread dusted with sesame and warm bowls of lentil soup so smooth it glides down your throat like velvet. You're not allowed to slouch. A eunuch behind you coughs gently every time you lean too far over your bowl. The other guests speak in measured tones, mostly Greek, some Latin, all elegant. A bishop remarks on the miracle of seasonal figs. A tax minister quotes Plato between bites of honeyed almonds. The table is a temple, and you'd better act like it. Historians largely agree that Theodora wielded immense influence, not just politically, but socially, and that included what showed up on imperial plates. Some fringe stories claim she demanded that no meal contain more than 7 ingredients, believing in culinary symmetry. Others whisper that she insisted certain dishes only be served during lunar phases, perhaps a leftover instinct from her time in the theater. Whether true or not, her taste is felt in every bite. One of her favorite dishes? Allegedly a stew made from chickpeas, leeks, and lamona. Humble nod to her roots, upgraded with imported saffron and served in bowls made of tinted glass. You try some. It's warm, tart, and deeply grounding. A spoonful of honesty in a room full of masks. And then there's Justinian, always calculating, always deliberate. He doesn't smile at jokes, but he does nod when someone praises the olive harvest. His wine cup rarely empties, yet he never seems to drink. He listens more than he speaks, and when he does, it's with the weight of law behind his words. You realize quickly that food here isn't just art, it's politics, law, legacy. Every dish confirms the empire's resilience. Every course says, "We are not the West. We have not fallen. We are the future," and it tastes like roasted duck with cinnamon glaze. There's a notable absence of pork, tonight likely intentional, considering the empire's increasing interactions with new religious communities. A nod to diplomacy, or perhaps an echo of prudence. Either way, the lamb is doing all the heavy lifting. Tender, infused with garlic and rosemary, served with a wheat pilaf dotted with raisins and slivers of almond. You eat slowly, trying not to look too impressed. It's difficult. Then comes the seafood course. Octopus grilled and drizzled with lemon thyme oil, anchovy paste served on barley rounds, a baked fish stuffed with mint, basil, and wild onions. The flavors are sharper here, brighter. You chew, swallow, and feel like you're eating sunshine that's been pressed into a loaf. Justinian speaks up low, but clear. A state is like bread, he says. You knead it too long, it toughens. Too little, and it falls apart. Theodora lifts a fig and raises an eyebrow. Then, let's not burn it, she adds. Laughter flickers around the table, careful and rehearsed. Dessert, naturally, is showy. A layered honey cake soaked in rosewater. Pistachio-studded nougat cut into squares so precise they look minted. Spoons of sweet yogurt drizzled with dates and topped with pomegranate seeds, each glistening like a jewel. You take a bite and feel your eyes roll back slightly, just as a server appears with a cloth to dab your forehead. No, really, that's a thing here. And yet, even amid all this richness, there's a thread of seriousness that runs through the meal. You can feel it. This isn't decadence for its own sake. It's proof. Proof that Rome didn't vanish, it evolved. Reinvented itself. It moved east, put on silk, and learned to pronounce gyros with a Greek accent. There's a moment near the end where silence falls not uncomfortable, but solemn. You realize dessert is finished. The plates are cleared. A servant lights a new oil lamp, and in that soft glow, Theodora reaches for a final almond and says, almost absent-mindedly, "A good empire knows how to eat." No one responds. They don't have to. You lean back slightly, full not just of food, but of awareness. This is survival in its most graceful form. Not stubborn or fearful, but calculated, elegant, exact. The empire may never taste like roast boar and vintage Falernian again, but it doesn't need to. It tastes like this now. And that's more than enough. You leave Constantinople's glittering feast with honey still clinging to your fingers and saffron dreams tickling the edges of your teeth. But as you wander through the colonnaded silence of night, the honey begins to cool. The dreams dissolve, because beyond the gold and gloss of Theodora's calculated elegance lies something else entirely. The slow-baking dread of plague, unrest, and empire trembling on its most expensive marble toes. You're still in the East, still technically in power, but things are cracking. And your next dinner companion knows all about cracks. It's Heraclius, and dinner with him feels like a march into the unknown, wearing sandals that are a half-size too tight. Heraclius greets you not in a banquet hall, but in a fortified encampment outside Constantinople. He's been on campaign again fighting Persians, chasing rumors of mutiny, or perhaps just trying to outrun the slow doom of entropy. His beard is dusted with flour, his robe smells faintly of smoke. His fingers are stained with something dark, which may be ink or may be plum juice. The man has been eating and planning simultaneously for weeks. You sit on a wooden bench beside him as dusk settles. There are no golden trays, no pistachio towers, just a battered table set with clay bowls, coarse bread, and something bubbling in a bronze pot. It smells sharp vinegar, onion, lamb. Comfort food for soldiers. Or maybe for an emperor who doesn't trust meals that sparkle too much. The stew is called harise. You scoop it up with torn bread. It's thick with cracked wheat, chickpeas, lamb shreds, and enough garlic to stun a merchant. It clings to your ribs and your soul. Heraclius eats with a spoon the size of a cavalry dagger. He chews like a man digesting decisions. Historians still argue whether Heraclius's obsession with food simplicity came from his military background or his exhaustion with court life. He was not born to palace-ish, took the throne after a mutiny, and never really let his shoulders drop. Some records say he preferred to cook his own meals while on campaign. Others claim he once ordered a grand banquet and canceled it mid-course, muttering, "Better we feed the grain to horses than courtiers." You believe all of it, especially tonight, as he dips his bread into lentil mash and mumbles about siege logistics. Around you, his staff eats in silence: hierarchs, generals, scribes. all chewing with the resigned intensity of people who know this might be the only warm thing they get all week. The wine is diluted and bitter, possibly on purpose. The bread is dense, baked without much leavening. A platter of grilled onions is passed around like a bowl of jewels. You snag one and find it surprisingly sweet, slow roasted over coals, slicked with olive oil, sprinkled with crushed herbs. It's the fanciest thing here, and it came from a fire pit beside a wagon. A fringe account says Heraclius had a peculiar love for preserved lemons. He'd keep slices of them in waxed linen pouches and chew one before speeches, claiming it sharpened his thoughts and masked the smell of battlefield armor. True or not, there's a jar of them on the table now, and you watch him pop one in his mouth and keep talking strategy without missing a beat. You're handed a bowl of frikiha smoky green wheat, cooked with bone broth and wild herbs. It's chewy, earthy, delicious in the way things become when there's no butter left in the empire. A few bites in, someone shouts about border movements near Syria. Heraclius wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, stands up, gives an order, and sits down again. He does not stop eating. There is a kind of quiet ceremony to this meal, not in what's served, but in how it's endured. There are no second helpings, no waiting between courses. The food arrives all at once, and you eat quickly, lest the world end before you've finished your stew. Yet even here, even amid wheat bowls and military maps stained with gravy, there is flavor, innovation, humanity. One young officer offers you a piece of flatbread that he's rubbed with garlic paste and folded around pickled turnips. It's sour, sharp, and glorious. Another offers figs poached in vinegar and sweet wine, a trick he claims was learned from Persian prisoners. You take one. It collapses in your mouth like memory. Heraclius pauses mid-bite and stares into the pot of stew. "You know," he says, "I once ate saffron lamb from a gold plate. I don't miss it." Then he eats another spoonful and gestures for the onions. The conversation shifts to theology inevitably. This is, after all, the age of the Monophysite controversy and the endless debates over divine nature. Heraclius listens, chews, and finally interrupts with, "God is probably less interested in the sauce and more in whether we share the bread." A bishop nearby grunts in resumes, gnawing on his barley cracker. One story claims Heraclius once ordered the court to forego all rich meals during a campaign, including the empress. She complete allegedly fasting on lentils and oil for 3 weeks. When asked why, Heraclius replied, "We cannot feast while our borders burn." You look around at this wind-blown camp table and see it for what it is not. Poverty, but policy. A declaration, Rome eats lean, or it does not eat at all. Dessert is fruit. Sort of. Dried plums and dates, dusted in flour and tossed into a wooden bowl like dice. You pop a date. It's chewy and rough around the edges, but still sweet. Still enough. Heraclius leans back, wipes his hands on a threadbare napkin, and smiles not broadly, but with the satisfaction of a man who's eaten what he needed and given the rest to others. As the meal ends, the pot is scraped clean. The bread is gone, the pickled lemons tucked away again. You rise with the rest of the diners and feel something odd, not fullness, but readiness. This wasn't dinner, it was armor, fuel. Proof that even emperors can eat with dust on their sleeves and still taste victory in lentils. And as the coals cool and the camp dims, you realize this empire doesn't feast to forget. It eats to remember what's worth saving. The sun hasn't fully risen when you find yourself following the scent of vinegar and oil through marble corridors again. But they're different now. Quieter, colder. The empire that once feasted to declare its invincibility now dines like someone watching the sky for falling tiles. The air feels thin, the curtains are drawn tighter, and yet, in the heart of Constantinople, one last grand table waits. It belongs to Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, perhaps the last truly powerful emperor of the Eastern Roman world, and a man whose relationship with food is, quite frankly, all business. Tonight's meal is a fortress. Not a feast, not a dream, not a prayer disguised as honey cake. It's a wall of calories braced against weakness. Basil doesn't eat for pleasure, not really. He eats to survive, to command, to maintain a body hardened by campaigns and a mind always half in armor. You're ushered into a hall that feels more like a barracks than a court. Polished stone, iron candle holders, long wooden benches, a fire that smells faintly of garlic and discipline. Basil sits already, cloaked not in silk but in armor, though it's ceremonial to night-polished bronze and crimson draped modestly. His knife is sharp. His bread is darker than the shadows clinging to the corners. And when he nods for you to sit, you feel as though you're joining a war council disguised as a supper. The first course is boiled wheat. Not porridge, not frika, just honest, unseasoned boiled wheat in a deep bowl, with a drizzle of vinegar and oil and maybe, if the kitchen was feeling generous, a sprig of parsley. Basil spoons it slowly, mechanically, eyes not on the bowl but on the maps nailed to the wall behind you. You chew. The grain is firm. The vinegar bites. It's austere. But in its own grim way, it's perfect. Historians generally agree Basil was one of the most ascetic emperors in Byzantine history. He avoided luxury, declined lavish robes, refused gold embellishment, 7 in his dining habits. It's said he often ate in solitude, or only with trusted commanders, preferring dried fruits and lentils over meat and pastries. A fringe tale even claims he once sent back a plate of peacock in front of visiting ambassadors, demanding the cook make a proper soldier's meal. He got a barley stew instead. Tonight, you don't see any peacocks. But there is meat sparingly, a skewer of roasted goat, charred and heavily salted, served with flatbread still warm from the oven. Basil pulls the meat from the stick with his teeth and doesn't blink. You follow suit, trying not to make eye contact with the piece of onion dangling from your own skewer like a broken tooth. Next comes a dish of lentils and garlic. Earthy, brown. Steam rises in thick curls. You recognize the smell now from previous imperial dietsets' survival food. But Basil's version is somehow leaner, tighter, like it's been through basic training. You eat. It's good. No flourishes, no garnish. Just sustenance wrapped in heat. He drinks from a silver cup, but the wine is weak, watered almost to the point of uselessness. He sips, then speaks low and sharp about troop movements, harvest totals, the grain yields in Anatolia. He doesn't ask for input. He's informing you. You nod. Your mouth full of barley. There's bread. Always bread. Basil is said to have enforced strict bakery regulations to prevent famine and price gouging. The loaves tonight are thick and rough. You need both hands to tear one apart. But once dipped into a bowl of vinegar-spiked oil, they soften just enough to feel like comfort. Barely. You glance at the other diners' generals, secretaries, a monk or two. Everyone eats quickly and with purpose. There's no small talk, no toasts. The only indulgence is a bowl of roasted chestnuts, lightly dusted with salt. Basil doesn't touch them, but you sneak one and savor the crunch. It tastes like victory left too long in the fire. One curious addition arrives late, a bowl of yogurt, tangy and slightly sweetened with chopped dates. Basil scoops a spoonful and eats it slowly. This, perhaps, is his version of dessert. You wonder if he ever had a honey cake or a pastry shaped like an amphora. Maybe. But if so, it didn't make the cut. There's a story, perhaps more legend than fact, that Basil once invited a visiting prince to dine with him and offered only boiled cabbage, onions, and bread. The prince, insulted, remarked that he'd expected more from an emperor. Basil replied, "An emperor must eat for duty, not display." then handed him a second bowl of cabbage. And it makes sense now. Everything about this meal is meant to keep the machinery of empire humming. Not a single dish is for show. Even the wine barely red, more blush than boldest, likely chosen for its digestive properties rather than its bouquet. Still, it's not joyless. The fire crackles, the bread is warm, and after the meal, Basil even smiles briefly as he hands you a handful of dried figs from a linen pouch. From Trebizond, he says. They last a month, just like a good soldier. You take one. It's chewy, sweet, and oddly moving. There's no dessert course, just a quiet closing of bowls, the gentle scrape of benches, and the rustle of wool as everyone rises. Basil doesn't linger. He leaves with a nod, a swirl of cloak, and the clink of mail. No fanfare, no speeches. Just the faint smell of roasted goat left behind. You step out into the courtyard, belly heavy with barley, and your boots echoing on the stones. The empire is no longer young. It doesn't shimmer, it doesn't sing, but it endures. Because its leaders at least the best of them know the value of vinegar over vanity, of wheat over whimsy. And tonight, you remember something Heraclius said, long ago by firelight. A state is like bread. Basil would agree, and he'd make you knead it yourself. You blink, and centuries pass. The stone under your sandals grows smoother, colder, like it's remembered too much. Constantinople is still here, still standing for now, but there's a hollow echo behind the gold leaf and incense. The walls are high, the shadows are longer, and the kitchens? They've changed. There's less garlic, less barley, more fear. Tonight, you dine in the waning years of Byzantium. Your host is Constantine XI Palaiologos, last emperor of Rome. He doesn't feel like a legend, not yet. He feels like a man shouldering a crumbling roof, pretending the house is fine. The palace has shrunk, the halls are faded, but the table is still set, because even as the Ottomans tighten the noose around the city, the empire refuses to eat like it's finished. You sit beside Constantine in a chamber that used to echo with music. Now it echoes with wind and memory. The windows are shuttered. A brazier glows faintly in the corner, and the meal what little there Aisha's been arranged with trembling precision. It's not a banquet. It's a prayer in food form. On the table, olives, salted, shrinking in their bowls like they know how the story ends. Next to them, black breadants, slightly burned. The crust is sharp enough to cut your gums if you're careless. And yet, you tear it. Because he does. And you eat. Because what else is there? The emperor's hands are rough. His cloak is threadbare at the sleeves, but his spine is straight and his eyes are fixed, not on you, but on the faint outline of the Hagia Sophia through a crack in the shutter. He's eating like it matters, like chewing keeps the city alive. Historians still argue whether Constantine's final days were spent in grim routine or hopeful defiance. Some say he fasted often. Others claim he insisted the palace kitchen maintain a daily table even when rations were low to remind everyone that Rome had not yet fallen. A fringe story insists he personally baked bread for wounded soldiers in the final week, before the siege breached the walls. Another claims he sat alone one night, eating cold lentils by candlelight, whispering old Latin prayers between spoonfuls. Tonight's meal fits both stories. You're served lentils, yes, again, but now they're grayer, softer, seasoned with nothing but thyme and salt. A bowl of stewed onions follows, sweet from caramelization, as if the cook wanted to offer comfort despite the scarcity. There's a single roasted fish, small, maybe a gift from a loyal fisherman who still dared to cast nets in the Bosphorus. It's dry, you eat it anyway. The wine, surprisingly, is good. Thinned with water, sure but fragrant. From an old store, perhaps, uncorked in recognition that sometimes you pour the best bottle when the sky is darkest. Constantine lifts his cup in silence. No toast. No words. But everyone at the table drinks, as if the silence is its own kind of anthem. There's a fig just one split, and served on a cracked ceramic plate. The skin is wrinkled. The inside glows amber under the flickering firelight. You chew it slowly. It's sweet, sticky, soft, and somewhere in the back of your mouth, it tastes like farewell. Around you, the conversation is practical. Fortress walls, grain stores, morale. Someone mentions a tunnel collapse near the seawall. Another talks about powder supplies. Constantine listens, eats, drinks, nods. It's as if this dinner, this final, threadbare ritualis, the last thing holding the structure of Rome together. If the emperor stops chewing, maybe the city crumbles. There's no dessert course. Not anymore. Just a bowl of water to rinse your fingers, and a faint smear of oil on your plate where the fish once lay. You feel the hunger in your bones now, not just from the meal, but from everything. From the weight of centuries, from the silence of legions, from the fading smell of roasted lamb, and the long-lost shimmer of garum. One of the advisors offers a final dish, a simple rice pudding, barely sweetened with cinnamon. You take a spoonful. It's warm, soft, comforting, like a lullaby made of milk. You look at Constantine. He's watching the flame in the brazier, eyes steady. He finishes his bite, places the spoon down gently, folds his hands. Then he speaks, not loudly, not to you specifically. They will take the walls, maybe the church, maybe the stones, but they will not take the bread from our table. Not while I breathe. The room falls still. No one argues, because he's not talking about food anymore. As the meal ends, no one rises right away. The plates are empty. The fire has dimmed. And outside, somewhere beyond the shutters, the night breathes against the walls of the last Roman city. But for a moment longer, you sit, and Rome still dines. You rise from that last Byzantine meal with a stomach full of lentils and a throat tight from something harder to name. Maybe it's history. Maybe it's the quiet dignity of Constantine XI eating like the weight of civilization depended on his fork. Either way, as you step outside into a cold, silent street under a sky full of smoke and stars, you feel it. The empire may be dying, but its obsession with food, that's not going anywhere. Because what is an empire, if not a menu of ideals, dressed in vinegar and wine? You follow the scent of cumin through time again, this time to a strange dinner after the fall, post-Byzantium. After the Ottomans take Constantinople in 1453, you're not sitting with emperors anymore. But oddly, you're not far from their kitchens. You're breaking bread with survivors, courtiers, cooks, chroniclers, those who once served emperors and now serve memories. You sit on a rooftop in the ruined quarter of Blackernay, among mismatched chairs and cracked dishes, under the sharp smell of wood smoke. The meal is modest: pickled vegetables, barley stew, and a dish of lentils that somehow refuses to die. There's cheese too hard and salty and olives rescued from an abandoned grove beyond the Theodosian walls. Someone's roasted a small chicken. Someone else brought flatbread wrapped in an embroidered cloth that used to be a bishop's altar cover. Everyone chews slowly, like they're trying to make the food last a decade. It's not imperial. Not anymore. But in a way, it's more sacred. Because now every bite is survival. A quiet rebellion against erasure. These people eat to remember. One of them, an old scribe who once managed the palace inventories, tells you about Basil II's barley rationing with tears in his eyes. Another woman once, a kitchen steward to a miner, Noble recounts a dessert Theodora loved, crushed almonds and honey layered in phyllo and chilled in snow from Mount Olympus. She can't make it anymore, but she closes her eyes and tastes it anyway. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine obsession with ceremonial food filtered directly into Ottoman court customs, or whether it simply faded like incense. But these diners, they believe it survived. They say that even the Turks, who took the kitchens and the palaces, kept certain recipes alive, because even conquerors like their chicken tender and their spices balanced. Tonight, a boy stirs a pot over a rooftop fire. It's full of wheat, onions, and goat fat. Not much, but it smells like empire. And when it's served, everyone pauses. Not to pray, just to remember. One man lifts a spoon and murmurs something in Greek. Another nods. You all eat. And then comes a surprise: someone's managed a dessert. A crude recreation of an ancient recipe. Dried figs boiled in wine, spiced with cinnamon and clove, then mashed into a paste and spread over flatbread. It's rough. The texture is closer to roofing tar than pastry. But the taste? It's haunting. Rich, warm, and heavy with nostalgia. You take a bite, and suddenly you're back in the halls of Septimius Severus. Back at Diocletian's cabbage table. Back in the candlelit strategy meals of Basil II. The food knows where it's been, even if the empire forgot. There's laughter tonight, despite the rubble. Someone burns their tongue on the stew and swears in Latin. Someone else drinks too much watered wine and sings a hymn half in Greek, half in nonsense. It doesn't matter. For one night, the table lives again. A fringe account, overheard on this rooftop, suggests that a few cooks from Constantine XI's kitchens survived the final sack and opened a small tavern in Galata. They served black bread and garlic stew to Turkish soldiers, who apparently loved it. If true, it's poetic. If not, well, someone still had to cook dinner the day after Rome fell. As the night wears on, the stars get brighter. The city is quieter than you've ever heard it. And yet the Smelsonian, vinegar, wood smoke still linger in the cracks of stone. Someone passes you a final cup of wine. It's bitter and thin, but it warms your chest. Across the table, a woman tears a piece of bread and offers it to the group. No speech, no blessing, just a hand offering something warm in the cold. And suddenly, it hits you. Rome didn't end in fire or marble dust. It ended in second helpings. Because in every lentil stew, in every crumbling loaf, in every fig boiled in desperation, the obsession continued. The empire may have fallen, but dinner was always served. You wake to the soft rattle of spoons in clay bowls, the sound of breakfast scraping against survival. The rooftop has emptied, save for one lingering cook, boiling something over coals, her back to the rising sun. She hums an old Roman hymn you don't recognize until it catches on a half-remembered Latin phrase. Panis et pax, bread and peace. It's never been just a motto. It's always been a recipe. Now you're drifting further from Empireno emperors left. No senate, no legion stamping through the kitchen to demand their rations. But the idea of Rome? Still sitting at the table. Tonight, you eat not with rulers, but with the remnants, the echoes that food remembers even when people forget. You find yourself in a Greek village, high in the hills, where a family sets out dinner in honor of some distant ancestry, maybe real, maybe mythologized. But their table is Roman in everything but name. Barley stew with garlic and oil, flatbread charred at the edges, grilled fish laid out on fig leaves. The grandmother stirs a pot of chickpeas so slowly you think time might just stop. The children sprinkle herbs with surprising care. And the wine pale, bitter homemade tastes exactly like the cup you once drank beside Heraclius. No one at the table calls themselves Roman. Not exactly. But every dish hums with the empire's ghosts. You recognize ingredients like old friends, leeks, lentils, honeyed nuts, preserved lemons. These people don't need to know about Domitian's cucumber greenhouse or Caracalla's cinnamon obsession. They carry that legacy in taste, in the way the stew simmers, in how the figs are arranged just so. One of the boys offers you a stuffed date rolled in sesame. He doesn't know it's a dish once served to senators in marble halls. He just knows it's good and sticky. You pop it into your mouth and taste all 5 centuries of ambition and decline, the crunch of seed, the sweetness of memory. You're told by the old man at the table he calls himself Thanos, and no, not that Thanos that this particular soup recipe comes from his grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, and she claimed it was Roman, or Byzantine, or maybe just old. He shrugs and ladles out another scoop. You eat it and wonder how many other forgotten emperors are hiding inside these bowls. Historians still argue how much Roman culinary tradition truly survived in peasant kitchens after the fall. Some say the techniques were absorbed into local customs. Others believe only scraps endured wheat here, a fish sauce recipe there. But sitting at this table, it feels like Rome never needed scrolls or statues. It just needed a stew pot and someone to stir it. The conversation flows like watered wine. Simple, direct, sometimes poetic. A girl asks if Rome ever had chocolate. Someone laughs. A cousin jokes about importing garum from a neighboring village and charging a denarius per scoop. Thanos raises a slice of bread and mutters something in Greek that roughly translates to, "May we never be too proud to eat what's left." The table nods. Dinner stretches lazily, not in grandeur but in comfort. There's no marble, no silk. But the food is steady, resilient. You notice the plates don't match. One is clearly from a Turkish bazaar, another from an Italian flea market. But all are full, and all serve the same purpose Rome always demanded from its food: identity. A fringe legend, shared by the eldest daughter, claims that during World War I, her great-grandmother baked barley loaves from a family recipe, traced directly back to Caesar's own baker. A wild claim, sure. But the bread? Dense, nutty, fragrant with anise. You believe it for 3 whole bites. As the sun dips behind the hill, someone lights a lantern. Moths dance around it, and the table becomes a quiet island of warmth. Dessert is goat cheese, drizzled with mountain honey. Thick, almost fermented. You smear it onto rough bread and chew slowly, feeling centuries seep into your molars. Then, something unexpected. A folded cloth appears on the table. Inside are fig cookies dried, stuffed, and dusted with flour. The woman who made them says her grandmother called them Domitian's pillows. Why? No one knows. But they taste like tired perfection. You eat 2 and save 1 in your pocket, just in case. By now, the table is half cleared. The old man is telling a joke about a Roman soldier who couldn't find a decent onion in Gaul. The kids are poking the fire with sticks. Someone begins humming again. And in this fading light, this table that technically belongs to no empire feels more Roman than anything carved in stone. Because you've learned something now. Food outlives the feast. Garum vanishes, but salted anchovies persist. The banquet fades, but barley stew remains. And whether you're eating on a marble chaise or a wooden bench covered in an old tapestry, the need is the same: to taste, to remember, to survive. You wipe your hands on your robe and look up. The stars are out again. They look the same as they did over Augustus's second course and Theodora's layered cakes and Heraclius's pickled lemons. They always do. And tomorrow? Tomorrow someone will stir lentils again. You've traveled through centuries on your stomach, eaten beside emperors and fugitives, dipped barley into wine and tears, and now here you are eat the quiet end of empire. Not in a palace, not in a senate chamber, but beside a hearth where the flames are small, and the pot bubbles with something simple, something familiar. Tonight, you don't dine in Rome, or Byzantium, or Ravenna, or even on a rooftop of Constantinople. You sit in a small kitchen tucked somewhere between history and memory, surrounded by the soft clatter of wooden spoons and the gentle music of boiling water. The woman stirring the pot doesn't wear a crown. She wears an apron. But as she lifts the lid and leans in to smell the garlic and herbs, she might as well be empress. She's cooking a dish passed down through generations, lentils, again, because of course. But now they're simmered in tomato, with a pinch of oregano and a whisper of chili, like time itself took the recipe and added a few modern edits. She tastes, nods, and hands you a bowl. It's hot. It's simple. It's everything. And around you, the room is filled with Pio not emperors, but descendants, not senators, but storytellers. A boy slices olives with concentration. A girl sets the table with unmatched plates. Someone pours wine into coffee mugs. Someone else sets out honey-drizzled walnuts. Every motion is ancient. Every step echoes with tradition, because food is the empire now. Historians still argue whether the Roman obsession with food was vanity, piety, politics, or survival. The truth is probably yes to all. What started as ritual became indulgence, then policy, then nostalgia, then memory. And in every era, every bite meant something. Whether to show off, to unify, to bribe, to grieve, or simply to live through one more winter, Rome ate with purpose. A fringe belief shared by a faded monk in a crumbling manuscript suggests that Rome never fell, that it still exists, wherever people sit to eat together and tell stories, that every meal is a small act of empire. That bread, broken and shared, is citizenship in the Republic of Memory. And as you eat your lentils, soft and bright with tomato, and pass the bowl of figs to someone who's never heard of Caracalla but loves the way honey sticks to their fingers, you believe it. Because it's not about the gold plates or the 10-course dinners or the garum amphorae buried in the sand. It's about the fact that people still gather, still stir pots, still raise glasses, still whisper recipes like spells. There's laughter now. Not imperial, not ceremonial, just warm, human, alive. Someone toasts to ancestors they've never met. Someone else passes more bread. The figs are almost gone. The pot of lentils scraped low. But no one complains. Because the meal did what it needed to. It fed the story. And now the candles flicker. The dishes clink into a wash basin. Someone hums a lullaby that sounds like a Roman marching song softened by time. You stretch your arms, sip the last of your wine, and let your eyes drift to the window, where the stars shine just like they did above the Palatine Hill. Rome is quiet now, but it's still eating. And maybe it always will be. You've walked far tonight across empire and ashes, from the glittering feast halls of Augustus to the quiet rooftop kitchens of a conquered Constantinople. You've dipped crusts into vinegar, cracked roasted chickpeas between your teeth, and sipped watered wine from hands both imperial and trembling. You've seen how a world could rise and fall by the weight of its appetite, how emperors defined themselves not only through conquest or law, but through what they served, and how they ate it. And now, the tables are cleared, the candles are low. You've wandered every course, every century, and though your feet may be tired and your belly full, the journey leaves behind a kind of warmth, slow, steady, quiet, like the last coals in a hearth, still glowing, long after the guests have gone. The empire has crumbled, the plates have chipped, but the recipes, those small, simmering testaments to love, survival, and absurd indulgence, they remain. Maybe not in scrolls or statues, but in kitchens, in spoons passed from mother to child, in stories told while peeling onions, in laughter shared over figs and olives and bread still warm from the oven. So now, let your thoughts settle. Let your breath slow. Imagine the table cleared, the wine sipped down to its final drop, and a breeze slipping through linen curtains soft, cool, steady. You're safe. The empire's worries can wait. Let the memories of warm bread and roasted garlic tuck you in, wrap you like a wool blanket spun in a Roman villa long gone. The fire is low, the stars are still, and you, dear traveler of history and hunger, can finally close your eyes. Sweet dreams.